Sarah Mitchell's excitement bubbled over as she steered her beat-up Honda Civic along the winding road leading into Sequoia National Park. The towering trees cast long shadows across the pavement, dappling the car with patterns of light and dark. In the passenger seat, her best friend Jess scrolled through her phone, occasionally holding it up to the window in a fruitless attempt to capture a bar of signal. "I think we're officially off the grid," Jess announced, tossing her phone into her bag with a dramatic sigh. "How much further?" Sarah glanced at the GPS on her dashboard, which was struggling to maintain a connection. "Should be another 15 minutes or so to the campground. You guys okay back there?" In the rearview mirror, she could see Mike and Ethan, crammed into the back seat amidst a pile of camping gear. Mike, his lanky frame folded awkwardly to fit, gave a thumbs up. Ethan, more compact but looking equally uncomfortable, nodded. "We're good," Mike said, his voice strained. "But I vote we stop at the first bathroom we see. That last gas station was questionable." Sarah laughed, feeling a surge of affection for her friends. They'd been planning this trip for months, a last hurrah, before their senior year of college began. 4 days of hiking, camping, and disconnecting from the world. It sounded like paradise. As they rounded a bend, the trees parted to reveal a breathtaking vista of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Sarah couldn't help but gasp, the majesty of the landscape momentarily overwhelming her. "Holy shit," Ethan breathed from the back seat. "It's like something out of a movie." "I can't believe we haven't done this before," Jess said, her eyes wide as she took in the view. "We've been missing out." Sarah nodded in agreement, a small knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. Despite her excitement, she couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. She'd grown up in the city, and while she loved the idea of camping, her actual experience was limited to a few backyard sleepovers as a kid. The others weren't much more experienced. Still, they'd done their research, bought all the right gear, and watched countless YouTube videos on camping safety. They were as prepared as they could be. The campground came into view, a clearing dotted with picnic tables and fire pits. A few other cars were already parked, their occupants busy setting up tents or unpacking supplies. Sarah pulled into an empty spot and cut the engine. "All right, team," she said, turning to face her friends. "Operation Wilderness Domination is officially underway. Let's do this." They piled out of the car, stretching cramped limbs and breathing in the crisp mountain air. The scent of pine and earth filled Sarah's lungs, and she felt a rush of exhilaration. This was going to be amazing. As they began unloading their gear, a park ranger approached, clipboard in hand. He was older, probably in his 50s, with weathered skin and kind eyes. "Afternoon, folks," he said, tipping his hat. "Welcome to Sequoia. I'm Ranger Thompson. Just need to check you in and go over a few safety guidelines." Sarah stepped forward, fishing their reservation confirmation out of her pocket. "Hi, I'm Sarah Mitchell. We have a site booked for 4 nights. Ranger Thompson nodded, checking something off on his clipboard. "Got you right here, Site 14, just down that path." He gestured to a trail leading deeper into the campground. "Before you head over, I need to give you our standard safety briefing. Won't take but a few minutes." The group gathered around, half listening, as the ranger went through the usual warnings about fire safety and leave-no-trace principles. Sarah tried to pay attention, but found her gaze wandering to the towering sequoias surrounding them. It was hard to focus on mundane safety rules when confronted with such natural beauty. "And of course, we need to talk about bears," Ranger Thompson was saying. Sarah's attention snapped back to him. "Bears?" Jess echoed, a note of concern in her voice. The ranger nodded gravely. "We've got a healthy black bear population in the park. They're generally not aggressive towards humans, but they can be dangerous if provoked, or if they associate campsites with food." He went on to explain the importance of proper food storage, emphasizing the use of bear-resistant containers and the park's bear lockers. Sarah felt that knot of anxiety in her stomach tighten. They'd brought a cooler for their food, but she wasn't sure if it was considered bear-resistant. "Remember," Ranger Thompson concluded, "a fed bear is a dead bear. They become habituated to human food, start causing problems, and eventually have to be put down. So it's crucial that you follow all our food storage guidelines." Mike raised his hand as if they were in a classroom. "What do we do if we actually see a bear?" The ranger's expression turned serious. "First, stay calm. Don't run. That can trigger their predatory instincts. Make yourself look big, make noise, and slowly back away. In the extremely rare case of an attack, fight back with everything you've got. But honestly, if you follow the guidelines, you're unlikely to have any problems. Sarah nodded, trying to commit every word to memory. She glanced at her friends, seeing a mix of excitement and nervousness on their faces. "Any other questions?" Ranger Thompson asked. They shook their heads, and the ranger handed Sarah a pamphlet with additional safety information. "All right then, enjoy your stay. Remember, we're here if you need anything." As he walked away, the group stood in silence for a moment, the reality of their situation sinking in. "Well," Ethan said finally, his voice overly cheerful, "who's ready?" "To become bear food?" Jess punched him in the arm. "Not funny, dude!" Sarah took a deep breath, pushing down her anxiety. "Come on, guys, we've got this. Let's go set up camp." They gathered their gear and made their way down the path to their assigned site. It was a beautiful spot, nestled among the trees with a small clearing for their tents. A fire pit and picnic table completed the scene. As they began setting up their tents, the earlier tension dissipated, replaced by the excited chatter of friends on an adventure. Sarah found herself relaxing, caught up in the simple joy of being outdoors with her favorite people. "Hey, Sarah," Mike called from where he was struggling with tent poles. "You're the one who watched all those camping videos. How does this go?" "Together again," Sarah laughed, moving to help him. "Here, let me show you. It's easier than it looks." As the afternoon wore on, their campsite slowly took shape. 2 tents stood proudly in the clearing, one for the girls, one for the guys. Their supplies were neatly organized, and a stack of firewood waited near the fire pit. Sarah stood back, hands on her hips, surveying their work with satisfaction. "Not bad for a bunch of city kids," she said, grinning. Jess flopped down in a camp chair, wiping sweat from her brow. "I feel like a real outdoors woman now. When do we start hunting for our dinner?" Ethan snorted. "I think the closest we'll get to hunting is trying to open those weird dehydrated meal packets we brought." As if on cue, Sarah's stomach growled. "Speaking of food, we should probably think about dinner soon. It'll be getting dark in a couple of hours." They gathered around the picnic table, unpacking their food supplies. Sarah frowned as she realized they had more than would fit in the bear locker provided at their site. "Guys," she said, holding up a bag of chips and a package of cookies, "where should we put the extra snacks?" "The bear locker's full?" Mike shrugged. "We could just leave them in the cooler. It's pretty sturdy." Sarah hesitated, remembering Ranger Thompson's warnings. "I don't know." He seemed pretty serious about the bear-resistant containers. "Come on." "Sarah," Ethan said, already opening the bag of chips, "what are the chances a bear is going to wander into our specific campsite on the first night?" "We'll be fine." Jess nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and we'll be right here. If we hear anything, we can just scare it off." Sarah wanted to protest further, but she could see she was outnumbered. And if she was honest with herself, the warnings were starting to feel a bit overblown. They were in an established campground, after all, not the deep wilderness. "All right," she conceded, "but let's at least try to eat most of this stuff tonight. The less we have out, the better." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, they gathered around the fire pit. Mike, who had been a Boy Scout for all of 2 months in middle school, took charge of building the fire. After several failed attempts and much good-natured ribbing from the others, he finally got a respectable blaze going. They roasted hot dogs over the flames, laughing and talking as the day's last light faded. Stars began to appear overhead, more than Sarah had ever seen in her life. The forest around them came alive with the sounds of night creatures, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. As they finished their meal, Ethan pulled out a flask from his backpack with a mischievous grin. "Who's up for some fireside cocktails?" Jess rolled her eyes. "Seriously, didn't the ranger specifically say no alcohol?" "What the ranger doesn't know won't hurt him," Ethan replied, taking a swig before passing the flask to Mike. Sarah hesitated when it came to her, but the warm glow of the fire and the excitement of the day won out over her usual caution. She took a small sip, grimacing at the burn of cheap whiskey. As the night wore on and the flask made several rounds, their conversation grew louder and more animated. They swapped ghost stories, sang off-key renditions of pop songs, and made grandiose plans for future adventures. It was well past midnight when Sarah finally stood up, swaying slightly. "Okay, guys, I think it's time to call it a night. We've got a big hike planned for tomorrow." There were groans of protest, but eventually they all agreed it was time for bed. As they started to clean up, Sarah noticed with a pang of guilt that they'd left more food out than she'd intended. Empty chip bags and half-eaten packages of cookies littered the picnic table. "We should really put this stuff away," she said. Her words slightly slurred. Mike waved a hand dismissively. "We'll do it in the morning. I'm too tired to deal with it now." Too exhausted and tipsy to argue, Sarah nodded. They doused the fire and stumbled to their respective tents. As she zipped herself into her sleeping bag, Sarah had a fleeting thought that they should have been more careful. But the warmth of the alcohol and the excitement of the day soon lulled her into a deep sleep. In the darkness beyond their campsite, unnoticed by the slumbering campers, a pair of eyes gleamed in the moonlight. The scent of food carried on the night air an irresistible lure. Silent paws padded towards the clearing, drawn by the promise of an easy meal. Sarah jolted awake, her heart pounding. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. The unfamiliar sounds and smells of the forest disoriented her, until memory rushed back. The camping trip, Sequoia National Park. She lay still, trying to identify what had woken her. A sudden crash outside the tent made her flinch. It sounded like metal hitting the ground, followed by a low grunt that was definitely not human. Beside her, Jess stirred. "Sarah?" Jess mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "What's going on?" "Shh," Sarah whispered, straining her ears. There it was again. The sound of something large moving around their campsite, accompanied by snuffling noises. Jess sat up, suddenly alert. "Is that—" Sarah nodded, fear clenching her stomach. "I think it's a bear." They sat in tense silence, listening to the sounds of destruction outside. Sarah's mind raced, replaying Ranger Thompson's warnings from earlier. They'd left food out. They'd been careless, drunk on whiskey and the false sense of security that came with being in a designated campground. A particularly loud crash made them both jump. Jess grabbed Sarah's arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "What do we do?" Jess whispered, panic evident in her voice. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "We need to make noise, scare it away, but we can't leave the tent. That might provoke it." She unzipped her sleeping bag as quietly as possible and crawled towards the tent opening. With trembling hands, she unzipped it just enough to peek out. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. A massive black bear stood at their picnic table, illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the trees. It was bigger than Sarah had imagined, its powerful body rippling with muscle as it poured through their supplies. The cooler lay on its side, contents spilled across the ground. Packages of food were strewn everywhere, torn open by powerful claws. As Sarah watched, frozen in terror, the bear raised its head and looked directly at her tent. She quickly zipped the tent closed, her breath coming in short gasps. "It's right there," she whispered to Jess. "It's destroyed everything." "Oh God," Jess moaned, "we're going to die." "No, we're not," Sarah said, with more confidence than she felt. "We just need to scare it away. On 3, we yell as loud as we can, okay?" Jess nodded, her face pale in the dim light. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. 1, 2, 3... They shouted in unison, their voices piercing the night air. "Hey, bear! Go away! Get out of here!" The sounds of destruction outside ceased abruptly. For a moment there was complete silence. Then, to Sarah's immense relief, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps moving away from their tent. "I think it worked," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it, but their relief was short-lived. A terrified yell erupted from the boys' tent, followed by a series of crashes and the unmistakable sound of canvas ripping. "Mike! Ethan!" Sarah called out, unzipping the tent without thinking. She scrambled out, Jess close behind her. The scene outside was chaos. Their campsite looked like it had been hit by a tornado, with food and supplies scattered everywhere. But Sarah barely registered this. Her attention focused on the boys' tent. It was collapsed, the fabric torn, and she could hear sounds of struggle from within. "Help!" Mike's voice called out, muffled by the canvas. "It's right outside!" Sarah's eyes darted around frantically, finally spotting the bear. It stood just beyond the collapsed tent, its massive form silhouetted against the trees. It turned its head towards her, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Even from this distance, she could see the intelligence in its eyes, the primal hunger. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her mind blank with terror. Then survival instinct kicked in. "The car!" she yelled, grabbing Jess's hand. "We need to get to the car." They sprinted towards the parking area, the sound of their pounding footsteps seeming impossibly loud in the quiet forest. Behind them, Sarah heard the bear's grunt, followed by the sound of it moving. "Mike, Ethan," she called over her shoulder. "Follow our voices. Get to the car." They reached the Honda, Sarah fumbling with her keys. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip them. Come on, she muttered, finally managing to hit the unlock button. They dove into the car, slamming the doors shut. Sarah jammed the key into the ignition, turning it with trembling fingers. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting. Through the darkness, in the harsh glare of the headlights, Sarah saw a sight that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. Mike and Ethan were running towards the car, terror etched on their faces. And behind them, moving with surprising speed for its size, was the bear. "Come on," Jess screamed, leaning out the window. "Hurry!" Mike reached the car first, yanking, opened the back door and practically diving inside. Ethan was only steps behind, but those steps felt like an eternity as the bear closed the distance. Just as Ethan's hand touched the door handle, the bear reared up on its hind legs, letting out a roar that seemed to shake the very air. Ethan stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and went down hard. "No!" Sarah screamed. Without thinking, she leaned on the horn, the loud blare cutting through the night. The sudden noise seemed to startle the bear. It dropped back to all fours. Hesitating for just a moment, it was enough. Ethan scrambled to his feet and threw himself into the car. Sarah didn't wait to see what the bear would do next. She threw the car into reverse, tires squealing as she backed out of the parking spot. The bear's massive form filled the rearview mirror, getting smaller as she accelerated down the campground road. For several minutes, no one spoke. The only sounds were their ragged breathing and the hum of the engine as Sarah navigated the winding road out of the campground. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, eyes darting constantly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the bear in pursuit. Finally, as they turned onto the main park road, Mike broke the silence. "Holy shit," he said, his voice shaky. That really happened, right?" A hysterical laugh bubbled up in Sarah's throat, but she choked it back. "Yeah," she managed. "It really happened. Is everyone okay?" she asked, glancing in the rearview mirror at Mike and Ethan. In the dim light from the dashboard, she could see they were both pale and wide-eyed, but seemed physically unharmed. "I think so," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was right there. I could feel its breath on my neck when I fell." Jess turned in her seat to look at them. "Your tent. We heard it collapse. What happened?" Mike ran a shaking hand through his hair. "We woke up to this massive weight on the tent. It was snuffling around, and then suddenly the whole thing just came down on us. We could feel it moving around. It's outside, pawing at the canvas. I thought we were dead," Ethan added. "If you guys hadn't made all that noise..." He trailed off, and silence fell over the car again. Sarah kept driving, not sure where she was going, but knowing she needed to put as much distance between them and the campsite as possible. After about 20 minutes, they came upon a well-lit ranger station. Sarah pulled into the parking lot, finally allowing herself to relax slightly. "We should report what happened," she said, turning off the engine. "And I don't know about you guys, but I don't think I can go back there tonight." There were murmurs of agreement from the others. They sat in the car for a few more minutes, each lost in their own thoughts before slowly, shakily making their way into the station. The next few hours passed in a blur. They gave their statements to the rangers, who listened with grave faces, and assured them they'd done the right thing by leaving. A team was dispatched to secure the campsite and assess the situation. As dawn began to break, they sat in the ranger station's small waiting area, clutching cups of bad coffee. They were all still in their pajamas, barefoot and disheveled. The adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving them exhausted and shell-shocked. "I found some large paw prints near your campsite," Ranger Thompson said, approaching them with a grim expression. "And there's significant damage to your equipment. You're lucky no one was hurt." Sarah nodded numbly. What happens now? She asked. We'll monitor the area, try to track the bear, the ranger replied. Sometimes when they get a taste of human food, they become problematic. We may need to relocate it. The words, a fed bear is a dead bear, echoed in Sarah's mind, and she felt a wave of guilt wash over her. Their carelessness could have doomed this animal. I'm sorry, she said, her voice cracking. We should have been more careful. We left food out, and Ranger Thompson held up a hand, cutting her off. What's done is done. The important thing is that you're all safe, but I hope this serves as a lesson, not just for you, but for anyone you tell this story to. Nature demands respect. They nodded solemnly. The ranger went on to explain that their campsite was off-limits while they assessed the situation. He offered to help them find alternative accommodations, but the group exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between them. I think we're ready to go home, Sarah said quietly, as they prepared to leave, gathering what little they had managed to grab in their hasty escape. Sarah stepped outside the ranger station. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold. The beauty of it struck her anew, but now it was tinged with a sense of danger, of wildness. She took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, trying to process everything that had happened. They had come here seeking adventure, a break from their ordinary lives. They had found it, but not in the way they expected. As her friends joined her, looking as shell-shocked as she felt, Sarah realized that this night had changed them. They had faced nature in all its terrifying glory and survived. They had made mistakes, nearly paid for them with their lives, but they had also learned valuable lessons. Ready to go? Jess asked softly, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah nodded, taking one last look at the towering sequoias. Yeah, she said. Let's go home. They piled into the car, quieter now than when they had arrived just a day earlier. As Sarah started the engine, she knew that the events of this night would stay with them forever. The terror, the adrenaline, the primal fear, but also the majesty of the wilderness, the importance of respect and caution. She pulled out of the parking lot, heading back towards civilization. Behind them, hidden in the depths of the forest, a black bear lumbered through the underbrush, wild and free, a reminder of the untamed heart of nature. The sun hung high in the cloudless sky as Sarah and her friends trudged along the narrow hiking trail. It had been 3 days since the bear incident, and despite their initial impulse to flee home, they had decided to stay. The rangers had assured them that the bear had been successfully relocated, and the lure of the majestic sequoia forest proved too strong to resist. I still can't believe we're doing this, Jess muttered, swatting at a persistent fly buzzing around her head. Sarah glanced back at her friend, noting the tightness around Jess's eyes. We can turn back if you want, she offered, though her tone suggested she hoped Jess wouldn't take her up on it. Jess shook her head. No, it's fine, I keep thinking I hear something behind every tree. Mike, who was leading the group, called back over his shoulder. That's just your survival. Instincts kicking in. Embrace it. We're finally becoming one with nature, Ethan snorted. Yeah, one with nature and all its terrifying man-eating creatures. Sarah rolled her eyes, but she couldn't deny the undercurrent of tension that ran through the group. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made them freeze, hearts racing. They were hyper-aware of their surroundings in a way they hadn't been before. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the massive sequoias towering overhead. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. Under different circumstances, Sarah would have found it breathtakingly beautiful. Now she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching them from the shadows. Hey, check this out, Mike called, pointing to a massive fallen tree that bridged a small ravine. Think that's stable enough to walk across? Sarah approached cautiously, peering down into the ravine. It wasn't terribly deep, but the sides were steep and rocky. I don't know, Mike, maybe we should stick to the trail. Come on, where's your sense of adventure? Mike grinned, already stepping onto the fallen trunk. It'll save us at least half an hour of hiking. Before Sarah could protest further, Mike was inching his way across the makeshift bridge. She held her breath, watching his every move. When he reached the other side safely, he turned and spread his arms wide. See? Piece of cake. Ethan shrugged. Well, if Mike can do it, it can't be that hard. He followed Mike's path, moving more slowly, but making it across without incident. Sarah and Jess exchanged glances. What do you think? Sarah asked. Jess bit her lip, looking uncertain. I guess if it means we get back to the campsite sooner. Steeling herself, Jess started across the log. Sarah watched anxiously, noting how Jess's knuckles were white where she gripped her backpack straps. About halfway across, Jess paused, swaying slightly. You've got this, Jess, Sarah called encouragingly. Just a few more steps. Jess nodded tightly and pressed on, visibly relaxing when her feet touched solid ground on the other side. Okay, your turn, Sarah. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped onto the log. The bark was rough under her boots, providing some traction, but she could feel the slight give of the dead wood. She focused on her feet, carefully placing one in front of the other. She was about 3/4 of the way across when she heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Sarah? Jess's voice sounded distant, muffled by the sudden rush of blood in Sarah's ears. Sarah, what's wrong? Slowly, carefully, Sarah raised her head. There on the bank she had just left stood a black bear. It was smaller than the one that had ransacked their camp, but no less intimidating. Its dark eyes were fixed on Sarah, lips curled back to reveal yellowed teeth. Oh my God, she breathed, her voice barely audible. Sarah, Mike's shout snapped her out of her paralysis. Sarah, don't move, we're going to distract it. The bear's head swiveled towards the sound of Mike's voice, and Sarah saw her chance. She lunged forward, scrambling across the remaining length of the log. Her foot slipped on a patch of loose bark, and for one heart-stopping moment, she felt herself falling. Then Ethan's hand was there, grabbing her arm and yanking her to safety. Sarah collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. She looked up just in time to see the bear lumber onto the log. Run, she screamed, scrambling to her feet. It's coming across. They took off down the trail, panic lending speed to their feet. Sarah could hear the crack of breaking wood behind them, followed by a splash and an angry roar. She risked a glance back and saw the bear pulling itself out of the ravine, wet and furious. It fell in, she called to the others. But it's still coming. They ran harder, veering off the main trail, onto a smaller, less defined path. Branches whipped at their faces and arms. Roots threatened to trip them at every step. But they pressed on, driven by pure adrenaline. Sarah's lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest, but she didn't dare slow down. She could hear the bear crashing through the underbrush behind them, steadily gaining ground. Suddenly the trees thinned and they burst out of the forest onto a rocky slope. Up there! Ethan pointed to a cluster of boulders partway up the hillside. We can climb those. They scrambled up the slope, loose rocks skittering under their feet. Sarah's hands were scraped raw by the time they reached the boulders, but she barely noticed the pain. She hauled herself up onto a large, flat-topped rock, turning to help Jess up beside her. The bear emerged from the tree line, its dark fur standing out starkly against the pale rocks. It paused, sniffing the air, then began to lumber towards their makeshift refuge. What do we do now? Jess asked, her voice shaking. Sarah's mind raced, trying to remember everything she'd ever learned about bear encounters. Make noise, she said. Lots of noise, and make ourselves look big. They began to shout and wave their arms, creating a cacophony that echoed off the surrounding rocks. The bear hesitated, clearly confused by the display. Hey, bear, Mike yelled, his voice cracking. Get out of here, you don't want any of this. For a tense moment the bear stood its ground, swaying from side to side as if considering its options. Then, to Sarah's immense relief, it turned and ambled back towards the forest. They kept up their noisy display until the bear disappeared into the trees, then collapsed onto the rock, exhausted and shaking. Is it gone? Jess asked, peering nervously over the edge of their perch. Sarah nodded, too winded to speak. They sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts as the adrenaline slowly drained from their systems. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. So, I guess the rangers were wrong about relocating that bear, huh? A slightly hysterical laugh bubbled up in Sarah's throat. I don't think it was the same one, she said. This one was smaller. God, how many bears are out here? Mike shook his head, running a trembling hand through his hair. I can't believe. This happened again. What are the odds? Pretty good, apparently, when you decide to go off trail in bear country, Sarah said, a note of anger creeping into her voice. What were you thinking, Mike? We should have stuck to the main path. Mike had the grace to look ashamed. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I just thought, I don't know what I thought. I guess I was trying to prove something. That we could still have an adventure, even after what happened at the campsite. Sarah's anger deflated as quickly as it had risen. She understood the impulse all too well. They had all been trying to recapture something on this hike. Their confidence, their sense of invulnerability, the exhilaration of being young and free in the wilderness. It's okay, she said, reaching out to squeeze Mike's shoulder. We all agreed to it, and hey, we handled it pretty well this time, right? No one panicked, we remembered what to do. Jess nodded, a wan smile on her face. Yeah, I guess those ranger talks finally sank in. Though I could have done without the practical application. They laughed, the sound tinged with relief and lingering nerves. As their laughter faded, a sobering realization settled over the group. We're going to have to get down from here eventually, Ethan said, voicing what they were all thinking. And then make it back to the campsite. Sarah took a deep breath, surveying their surroundings. The forest stretched out below them, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. She could see the main trail in the distance, a thin ribbon winding through the trees. Okay, she said, slipping naturally into the role of leader. Here's what we're going to do. We'll wait here for another 15 minutes or so, make sure the coast is clear. Then we'll make our way back to the main trail, carefully and quietly. We stick together, no splitting up for any reason. We make noise as we walk so we don't surprise any animals. And we get back to the campsite as quickly as possible. Agreed? The others nodded, looking to her with a mixture of trust and relief. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but also a surge of determination. They had faced their fears and survived. Twice now. They could do this. As they waited, Sarah found herself reflecting on the events of the past few days. They had come to Sequoia seeking adventure, a chance to test themselves against the wilderness. In a way, they had gotten exactly what they asked for, though not in the form they expected. The forest had shown them its beauty and its danger, its indifference to human desires and fears. It had pushed them to their limits, forced them to confront their own mortality in a way their comfortable city lives never had. And yet Sarah realized she didn't regret coming. Despite the terror, despite the danger, there was something exhilarating about facing the raw power of nature and surviving. They would leave these woods changed, carrying with them a newfound respect for the wild and a deeper understanding of their own resilience. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Sarah stood up. "All right," she said, her voice steady and determined. "Let's go home." One by one, they climbed down from their rocky sanctuary, eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. As they set off towards the main trail, Sarah felt a mix of emotions swirling within her. Fear, excitement, humility, and a fierce pride in her friends and herself. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would face them together. Stronger for the trials they had endured in the shadow of the great sequoias. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted through the dense forest, branches whipping at her face and arms. The sound of heavy breathing and crashing undergrowth behind her spurred her on, adrenaline masking the burning in her legs and lungs. "Keep going!" Mike's voice called out from somewhere to her left. "Don't look back!" But Sarah couldn't help herself. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. The bear was closer than she'd thought, its massive form breaking through the foliage with terrifying speed. Its eyes locked onto hers, and Sarah felt a primal fear course through her veins. She turned back, pushing herself harder. The forest floor was treacherous, roots and fallen branches threatening to trip her with every step. She leapt over a fallen log, her foot catching on the edge. For one heart-stopping moment, she felt herself falling, but somehow managed to regain her balance. "Sarah?" Jess's panicked voice came from ahead. "This way." Sarah veered towards the sound, bursting through a thick patch of bushes. She found herself in a small clearing where Jess stood, wide-eyed and panting. "Where's Ethan?" Sarah gasped, realizing they were one short. Jess shook her head, fear evident in her eyes. "I don't know. We got separated back there. Before Sarah could respond, Mike crashed into the clearing, his face scratched and bleeding from the unforgiving branches. "It's still coming," he panted, doubling over with his hands on his knees. "We need to keep moving." Sarah's mind raced. They couldn't leave Ethan behind, but staying put meant certain danger. As if to emphasize the point, a roar echoed through the trees, closer than ever. "Up," Sarah decided, pointing to a large sequoia at the edge of the clearing. "We need to get up high." They scrambled towards the tree, its lower branches just within reach. Mike boosted Jess up first, then turned to help Sarah. As Sarah grasped the rough bark, preparing to climb, a cry of pain cut through the air. "Ethan!" Sarah yelled, recognizing the voice instantly. She hesitated, one foot on the tree, torn between self-preservation and the need to help her friend. Mike made the decision for her, practically shoving her up the tree. "I'll get him," Mike said, his face set with determination. "You two stay up there." Before Sarah could protest, Mike was gone, disappearing back into the undergrowth. Sarah climbed, higher, her hands shaking so badly she nearly lost her grip more than once. She reached Jess on a wide branch about 20 feet up, both of them pressing their backs against the massive trunk. "Oh, God," Jess whimpered, her eyes fixed on the forest floor below. "What if it can climb?" Sarah shook her head, trying to remember what she'd learned about bear behavior. "Black bears can climb, but I don't think they usually do when they're chasing prey. We should be safe up here." As if summoned by her words, the bear burst into the clearing. It stood on its hind legs, sniffing the air, its head swiveling as it searched for its quarry. Sarah and Jess held their breath, pressing themselves as close to the tree as possible. For a moment it seemed the bear might move on. Then another cry echoed through the forest, and the bear's head snapped towards the sound. It dropped to all fours and lumbered off in the direction Mike had gone. "No," Sarah breathed, her heart sinking. She turned to Jess. "We have to help them." Jess's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you crazy? We can't go down there." "We can't just leave them," Sarah insisted, already starting to climb down. Mike went back for Ethan. "We have to do the same for them." Jess hesitated, clearly torn. Finally she nodded, following Sarah down the tree with shaking limbs. As soon as their feet hit the ground, they heard another roar, followed by a very human scream. Without a word, they took off running towards the sound, fear for their friends, overriding their own safety. They crashed through the forest, branches tearing at their clothes and skin. Sarah's foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling to the ground. She scrambled up, ignoring the pain in her ankle, and pressed on. They burst into another small clearing and froze at the sight before them. Ethan was on the ground, clutching, his leg, his face contorted in pain. Mike stood in front of him, a large branch held like a baseball bat, facing off against the bear. The bear was fully reared up on its hind legs, its height terrifying. It swiped a massive paw at Mike, who barely managed to dodge the blow. The branch connected with the bear's side, but it seemed to only enrage the animal further. "Hey!" Sarah yelled, her voice cracking with fear and desperation. "Over here!" The bear's head swiveled towards them, momentarily distracted. Mike used the opportunity to grab Ethan, hauling him to his feet. Ethan cried out in pain, but managed to hobble with Mike's support. "Run!" Mike yelled at Sarah and Jess. "Get back up a tree," but there was no time. The bear dropped back to all fours and charged, not at Mike and Ethan, but straight at Sarah and Jess. Sarah's mind went blank with terror. All the advice about standing your ground, making yourself look big, it all evaporated in the face of the oncoming threat. At the last possible second, Sarah's survival instinct kicked in. She shoved Jess hard to one side and dove in the other direction. She felt the rush of air as the bear passed between them, its bulk missing her by inches. Sarah rolled to her feet, adrenaline masking any pain from the fall. The bear skidded to stop, seeming confused by the scattering of its prey. It turned, eyes locking onto Sarah, who stood closest. Time seemed to slow down. Sarah could see every detail of the bear's face, the moisture on its black nose, the yellowish tint to its teeth, the intelligence and hunger in its small, dark eyes. She knew she should run, but her legs wouldn't respond, just as the bear tensed. To charge again, a deafening crack split the air. The bear reared back, roaring in pain and confusion. Another crack, and the bear turned tail, crashing back into the forest. Sarah stood frozen, her ears ringing from the gunshots. She turned to see a park ranger emerging from the trees, rifle in hand. "Is everyone all right?" the ranger called, quickly surveying the scene. The question seemed to break the spell. Sarah rushed to where Jess was struggling to her feet, while Mike helped Ethan limp towards them. "Ethan's hurt," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "His leg?" The ranger nodded, already pulling out a radio. "This is Ranger Davis. I need medical evac at my location. Possible bear attack. 1 injured, 3 shaken up." The next hour passed in a blur. More rangers arrived, along with paramedics who tended to Ethan's leg, a bad sprain, possibly fractured from a fall while running. They were all checked over, treated for minor cuts and bruises. Sarah barely felt the sting as antiseptic was applied to the scratches on her arms and face. As a ranger took their statements, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Sarah felt herself start to shake, delayed shock setting in. "You're lucky to be alive," Ranger Davis said gravely. "Going off-trail in bear country, separating when you encountered the bear, these are exactly the kind of mistakes that get people killed." Sarah nodded numbly. We thought we knew what we were doing. After the first encounter at our campsite, we felt like we could handle anything." The ranger's expression softened slightly. "Overconfidence is a common mistake, especially among young people. Nature has a way of reminding us how small we really are." As they were loaded into vehicles to be taken back to the ranger station, Sarah found herself seated next to Mike. He looked as shell-shocked as she felt. "I can't believe you came back for us," Sarah said quietly. Mike gave a weak smile. "Couldn't leave you behind. Besides, it was my fault we were out there in the first place. Had to try and make it right." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand. No more words were necessary. At the ranger station, they were reunited with their families who had been called after the incident. There were tears, hugs, and stern words about responsibility and safety. Sarah's parents held her tightly, and she felt like a child again, safe in their embrace. As they prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look at the majestic sequoias silhouetted against the setting sun. Despite everything, she felt a pang of regret at leaving. The forest had shown them its beauty and its danger, its indifference to human life and its raw, untamed power. Jess came to stand beside her, following her gaze. "I never want to see another tree again," she said, only half joking. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. Part of me wants to come back someday." Jess looked at her like she'd grown a second head. "Are you insane? After what we just went through?" "Not anytime soon," Sarah clarified, "and definitely not without a lot more preparation and respect for the wilderness. But I don't want this to be the end of our story with nature, you know? I don't want fear to be the last word." Jess was quiet. For a moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe. Someday. But for now, I vote we stick to city parks and nature documentaries." Sarah laughed, feeling some of the tension of the past few days finally start to ease. As they turned to join their families, she took one last deep breath of the crisp mountain air. The forest had changed them, pushed them to their limits and beyond. They had faced their fears, made mistakes, and somehow survived. Whatever came next, Sarah knew they would face it with a newfound respect for the wild and a deeper understanding of their own resilience. The bear attack would always be a part of their story, a reminder of both the terror and the beauty of the untamed world. But it wouldn't be the end of their story. Someday, when the nightmares faded and the scars healed, they would return to the wilderness, older, wiser, and ready to write a new chapter. Sarah stumbled through the dense undergrowth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest, which had seemed so beautiful just hours ago, now felt oppressive and alien. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, every rustle of leaves sending a jolt of fear through her body. "Jess," she called out, her voice hoarse. "Mike, Ethan, where are you?" Only the distant call of a bird answered her. Sarah stopped, leaning against a massive sequoia trunk, trying to orient herself. The adrenaline from their encounter with the bear was wearing off, leaving her shaky and disoriented. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to take deep breaths. "Think, Sarah," she muttered to herself. "Which way did we come from?" The frantic flee from the bear had left her completely turned around. The dense canopy overhead obscured the sun, making it impossible to use it for direction. Sarah fumbled in her pocket for her phone, but the screen remained stubbornly black. The battery must have died during their ordeal. A twig snapped somewhere to her left, and Sarah's head whipped around. "Hello?" she called, hope and fear warring in her voice. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then a low, rumbling growl that made her blood run cold. "No," Sarah whispered, pushing herself off the tree. "No, no, no." She started moving again, no longer caring about direction, only about putting distance between herself and that sound. Branches whipped at her face and arms as she pushed through the underbrush, leaving stinging scratches in their wake. The sound of heavy footfalls behind her spurred Sarah to greater speed. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. Through the trees, she caught a glimpse of dark fur and gleaming eyes. The bear was back, and it was gaining on her. Sarah's foot caught on an exposed root, sending her sprawling to the forest floor. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the burning pain in her ankle. As she started to run again, she realized she'd lost one of her shoes in the fall. There was no time to go back for it. The terrain began to slope upward, the ground becoming rockier. Sarah's lungs burned as she pushed herself up the incline. She could hear the bear crashing through the undergrowth behind her, getting closer with each passing second. Suddenly the trees thinned, and Sarah found herself at the edge of a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated wooden structure, an old ranger station or fire lookout long abandoned. Without hesitation, Sarah sprinted towards it. She hit the weathered door with her full weight, nearly sobbing with relief when it gave way. Sarah slammed it shut behind her, frantically searching for a lock. There was none, but an old wooden chair sat nearby. She wedged it under the doorknob, praying it would hold. The interior of the lookout was small and musty, dust-covered surfaces. Fanned cobwebs spoke of years of neglect. A rickety ladder led up to a hatch in the ceiling, presumably to an observation deck. Sarah had barely caught her breath when a heavy impact shook the entire structure. The bear had reached the lookout. Another blow rattled the door in its frame, the chair creaking ominously. "Help!" Sarah screamed, knowing it was futile. There was no one around for miles. "Somebody help me!" The window beside her exploded inward as a massive paw swiped through it. Sarah shrieked, stumbling backward. The bear's head followed, its hot breath fogging the remaining glass as it snarled at her. In a panic, Sarah turned to the ladder. She scrambled up it, splinters digging into her palms. The hatch above her was stuck, swollen with age and humidity. Sarah pushed at it with all her strength, acutely aware of the sounds of destruction below, as the bear forced its way into the lookout. With a final, desperate shove, the hatch gave way. Sarah pulled herself up onto the observation deck, slamming. The hatch shut behind her. There was no way to secure it from this side. The deck offered a panoramic view of the forest, the sequoias stretching as far as the eye could see. Under different circumstances, it would have been breathtaking. Now it only served to emphasize how isolated Sarah was. A splintering crash from below told her the bear had made it inside. Heavy footsteps on the ladder sent Sarah's heart into overdrive. She pressed herself against the railing, as far from the hatch as she could get. The hatch burst open and the bear's head emerged. It struggled to pull its bulk through the opening, growling in frustration. Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before it made it through. She looked around desperately for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes fell on a long metal pole, propped in the corner, some kind of lightning rod or antenna. Sarah lunged for it, her hands wrapping around the cool metal, just as the bear hauled itself fully onto the deck. Time seemed to slow down. Sarah could see every detail of the bear's face, the moisture on its black nose, the yellowish tint to its teeth, the intelligence and hunger in its small dark eyes. She knew she should be terrified, but a strange calm had settled over her as the bear reared up on its hind legs. Sarah planted her feet and swung the metal pole with all her might. It connected with the side of the bear's head with a sickening thud. The bear roared in pain and anger, swiping at her with a massive paw. Sarah ducked, feeling the rush of air as claws passed inches from her face. She swung again, catching the bear in the shoulder. But the glancing blow only seemed to enrage it further. The observation deck creaked ominously under their combined weight. Sarah realized with horror that the old wood wouldn't hold much longer. As if in response to her thought, a loud crack split the air. Time sped up again. The deck tilted sharply, sending both Sarah and the bear tumbling. Sarah's stomach lurched as she felt herself falling. Her hand shot out, somehow managing to grab onto the railing. She dangled there, feet kicking in empty air, as the rest of the deck collapsed. The bear's roar turned to a bellow of surprise as it plummeted to the ground below. Sarah heard the impact, followed by a pained whimper that quickly faded into silence. For several long moments Sarah hung there, her arms screaming in protest. Then slowly, carefully, she pulled herself back up onto what remained of the deck. She lay there gasping for breath, her whole body shaking. When she finally found the strength to move, Sarah crawled to the edge and peered over. The bear lay motionless on the ground far below, half buried in the wreckage of the observation deck. Whether it was dead or merely unconscious, Sarah couldn't tell. She had no intention of going down to check. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of her situation set in. She was alone, injured, and lost in the wilderness. Night was falling, bringing with it the threat of cold and other predators. And somewhere out there, her friends were still missing. Sarah closed her eyes, fighting back tears of exhaustion and fear. She allowed herself one moment of weakness, one choked sob escaping her lips. Then, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, she pushed herself to her feet. "Okay," she said aloud, her voice sounding small in the vastness of the forest. "Okay, Sarah, you can do this, one step at a time." She made her way carefully down the creaking ladder, pausing at the bottom to listen for any sign of movement from outside. Hearing nothing, she edged towards the broken window, peering out into the gathering dusk. The forest was quiet, painted in shades of purple and blue as the last light faded from the sky. Sarah knew she should try to find her way back to the trail, back to civilization. But in the darkness, with no idea which direction to go, she'd be more likely to get herself even more lost. "Shelter," she muttered to herself. "That's what they always say. Find shelter for the night." The lookout, damaged as it was better than nothing. Sarah set about gathering what she could to make it more secure. Broken pieces of furniture to block the window, a moldy old blanket she found in a corner to wrap herself in. As full dark settled over the forest, Sarah huddled in the least exposed corner of the lookout. Every sound from outside made her flinch, imagining bears, mountain lions, or worse coming to investigate. She was exhausted, but too wired with fear to sleep. To keep herself awake and sane, she began to talk to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come on, guys, where are you? Jess, you've got to be looking for me, right? Mike, Ethan, please be okay, please find me." As the hours crawled by, Sarah's thoughts turned to home, to her parents, who had been so worried about this trip, to the life she had taken for granted, the simple safety of her everyday world that now seemed like a distant dream. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm so sorry, I should have listened, should have been more careful." A sound from outside made her freeze. Footsteps, but lighter than a bear's. A flashlight beam cut through the broken window. "Hello?" a voice called. "Is someone in there?" Sarah's heart leapt. "Yes," she cried, scrambling to her feet. "Yes, I'm here. Help!" The door burst open, revealing a park ranger, his flashlight illuminating Sarah's tear-streaked face. "Oh, thank God," the ranger said, quickly crossing to her. "Are you Sarah Mitchell? Your friends have been looking everywhere for you." Sarah nodded, a sob of relief escaping her. "My friends, they're okay?" The ranger nodded, already guiding her towards the door. "They're fine, a little banged up, but fine." They made it back to the trail and found another group of hikers with a satellite phone. "We've had search parties out all night." As they stepped outside, Sarah saw more flashlights approaching through the trees. She heard a familiar voice call. Out her name, "Sarah!" "Oh my God, Sarah!" Jess burst into the clearing, enveloping Sarah in a fierce hug. Mike and Ethan were right behind her, their faces a mix of relief and lingering fear. We were so worried." Jess sobbed into Sarah's shoulder. Sarah hugged her back just as tightly, feeling the last of her strength give way. She sank to her knees, bringing Jess with her, as Mike and Ethan joined the embrace. For a long moment they just held each other, the terror of the past hours giving way to profound relief. They were alive. They were together. They had survived. As the rangers prepared to lead them back to safety, Sarah cast one last look at the old lookout. In the pale light of dawn, she could see the crumpled form of the bear still lying where it had fallen. A pang of something, regret, respect, went through her. The forest had tested them, pushed them to their very limits. It had shown them its beauty and its terror, its indifference to human life and its raw, untamed power. They had entered as naive college students, sure of their invincibility. They would leave forever changed, carrying with them a newfound respect for the wilderness and a deeper understanding of their own resilience. Sarah turned away from the lookout, leaning on her friends as they began the long walk back to civilization. The adventure was over, but its impact would stay with them forever. In facing their fears, in confronting the primal terror of being prey, they had discovered strengths they never knew they possessed. As the first true light of day filtered through the canopy, Sarah felt a glimmer of something unexpected, a desire to return someday, not out of bravado or naivety, but with proper respect and preparation, to face the wilderness again older and wiser, and to write a new chapter in their story. For now, though, she was content to leave the great sequoias behind, to return to the safety of the known world, carrying with her the profound lessons of the wild. The forest had changed her, had changed all of them, and in that change, traumatic as it had been, lay the seeds of growth and wisdom that would shape the rest of their lives. The crunch of leaves underfoot echoed through the forest as Sarah pressed on, her senses hyper-alert to every sound and movement around her. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her with grasping fingers. She had been walking for hours, or was it days? Time had lost all meaning in her desperate struggle for survival. "Keep it together, Sarah," she muttered to herself, her voice hoarse from dehydration. "One foot in front of the other. You can do this." But even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her. She had no idea where she was, no food, no water, and night was approaching fast. The memory of her narrow escape from the bear at the lookout tower was still fresh, the adrenaline long since faded to a bone-deep exhaustion. A twig snapped somewhere to her left, and Sarah froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She strained her ears, trying to determine if it was just her imagination or something more sinister. "Hello?" she called out tentatively, immediately regretting it as her voice seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. There was no response, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. Sarah could feel eyes on her, watching from the shadows. Whether animal or human she couldn't tell, but the sensation sent chills down her spine. She started moving again, faster now, no longer caring about stealth. The fading light lent an urgency to her steps. She needed to find shelter, and soon. As if in answer to her unspoken prayer, the trees ahead began to thin. Sarah quickened her pace, hope rising in her chest. Maybe she had finally found her way. Back to a trail or even to the campground. She burst through the tree line and skidded to a halt, her hope turning to ash in her mouth. Before her stretched a vast meadow, beautiful in the golden light of sunset, but offering no shelter, no salvation. "Just more wilderness." "No," Sarah whispered, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "No, no, no!" She sank to her knees, the long grass tickling her arms. The enormity of her situation crashed over her like a wave. She was lost, truly lost, in a forest that seemed to stretch on forever. As the last light began to fade from the sky, Sarah forced herself to her feet. She couldn't stay here in the open. Reluctantly, she turned back to the forest's edge, searching for any kind of shelter. A large fallen tree caught her eye, its massive roots torn from the earth to create a small hollow. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Sarah crawled into the space, using fallen branches and leaves to create a makeshift barrier. As full dark settled over the forest, strange noises began to emerge. Hoots and howls, rustles and growls, each sound sending a fresh spike of fear through Sarah's body. She huddled deeper into her shelter, trying to make herself as small as possible. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, though she wasn't sure who or what she was pleading with. Please let me make it through the night." Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity of fear and discomfort. Sarah dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, real or imagined. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, she heard something that made her blood run cold, a low, rumbling growl, unmistakably close. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She peered out through the gaps in her shelter, her eyes straining in the dim light. At first she saw nothing. Then a shadow moved against the trees. The bear emerged from the forest, its massive form silhouetted against the lightening sky. It was huge, larger than the one that had attacked them at the campsite, larger even than the one at the lookout tower. Sarah pressed herself back against the tree roots, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the bear must hear it. She watched, paralyzed with fear, as the bear lumbered into the meadow. It paused, raising its head to sniff the air. Sarah held her breath, praying that the wind was in her favor. For a long moment, the bear stood still, its small eyes scanning the meadow. Then, slowly, inevitably, its gaze settled on Sarah's hiding place. Time seemed to stand still. Sarah stared into the bear's eyes, seeing intelligence there and hunger. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to her core that her flimsy shelter would offer no protection. The bear took a step towards her, then another. Sarah's mind raced, searching desperately for a plan, an escape route, anything. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Just as the bear reached the edge of her shelter, a sound split the air, a long, low whistle, followed by a shout. "Hey, hey, bear!" The bear's head snapped around, looking for the source of the noise. Sarah couldn't believe her ears. She knew that voice. "Over here, you big furball! Come on, Mike!" It was Mike's voice, coming from the far side of the meadow. The bear hesitated, torn between the easy prey in front of it and this new disturbance. "Sarah!" Another voice called out, this one female. Jess. "Sarah, if you can hear us, make some noise!" Sarah wanted to call out, to run towards her friends' voices, but fear kept her rooted to the spot. The bear was still too close, its attention now divided between her and the sounds from across the meadow. Suddenly, a flare shot into the sky, bathing the meadow in red light. The bear reared up on its hind legs, startled by the sudden brightness. "There," Ethan's voice this time, "I see something by that fallen tree." The bear dropped back to all fours, clearly agitated now. It took a step towards Sarah's shelter, then swung back towards the voices, uncertain. In that moment of indecision, Sarah found her voice. "Here!" she screamed, bursting out of her shelter. "I'm here, help!" The bear's head whipped around, its eyes locking onto Sarah's moving form. It charged, covering the distance between them with terrifying speed. Sarah ran, her legs burning, her lungs on fire. She could hear the bear's heavy breathing behind her, feel the vibration of its footfalls in the earth. Gunshots rang out, the sound echoing across the meadow. Sarah heard the bear roar in pain and confusion. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw the massive animal veering off, running back towards the tree line. "Sarah!" Multiple voices called her name now. She saw figures running towards her across the meadow, her friends and others she didn't recognize. Park rangers, maybe. Her legs gave out and she collapsed to the ground. Strong arms caught her before she hit the earth. She looked up to see Mike's face, streaked with dirt and tears. "We found you," he choked out. "Oh God, Sarah, we found you." Jess and Ethan were there too, all of them wrapping Sarah in a group hug. She clung to them, sobs racking her body as the tension of the past days finally released. I thought I'd never see you again," Sarah managed between sobs. "We never stopped looking," Jess said fiercely. We wouldn't leave you out here alone." A park ranger approached, his rifle still at the ready. "We need to move," he said urgently. "That bear might come back. Can you walk?" Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. With her friend's support, she got to her feet. They began to make their way across the meadow, towards the waiting rescue vehicles. As they walked, Sarah's friends filled her in on what had happened. After they got separated, they had managed to find their way back to a trail. They'd run into another group of hikers with a satellite phone and called for help. Search parties had been combing the forest for days. "We were about to expand the search area even further," Ethan explained. "If we hadn't found you today, He trailed off, but Sarah understood. She had been on the verge of being truly lost, perhaps never to be found. As they reached the vehicles, Sarah turned for one last look at the forest. The rising sun painted the treetops gold, the beauty of it almost painful after the terror of the night. A movement at the forest's edge caught her eye. For a brief moment she saw the bear standing there, watching them. Their eyes met across the distance, and Sarah felt something pass between them, not understanding exactly, but a recognition. They were two living beings who had encountered each other in the vastness of nature, each fighting for survival in their own way. Then the bear turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows beneath the great sequoias. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding as the rescue team helped her into a vehicle. As her friends crowded around her with blankets and water and endless questions, she felt the experience of the past days settling into her bones. The forest had tested her, pushed her to her very limits. It had shown her terror beyond anything she'd ever known, but also beauty and wonder that she would never forget. She had entered these woods a naive college student, sure of her place in the world. She would leave forever changed, carrying with her a newfound respect for the wilderness and a deeper understanding of her own resilience. As the vehicle began to move, taking them back towards civilization, Sarah leaned her head against the window. The great sequoias passed by in a blur of green and brown. She felt a mix of relief and something else, a strange, unexpected longing. She knew with a certainty that surprised her that this would not be her last encounter with the wild. Someday, when the nightmares faded and the scars healed, she would return, not out of bravado or naivety, but with proper respect and preparation, to face the wilderness again, older and wiser, and to write a new chapter in her story. For now, though, she was content to leave the forest behind, to return to the safety of the known world, carrying with her the profound lessons of the wild. The forest had changed her, had changed all of them, and in that change, traumatic as it had been, lay the seeds of growth and wisdom that would shape the rest of their lives. As the last of the great trees disappeared from view, Sarah closed her eyes. She was going home, carrying the wilderness within her. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Ranger Thompson's radio crackled to life. He snatched it up, hope and dread warring in his chest. "Thompson here. Any news?" "Negative on the missing hikers," came the reply, tinged with fatigue. "But we've got reports of a bear sighting near Morro Rock. Tourists say it seemed agitated." Thompson sighed, rubbing his temples. It had been 3 days since the group of college students had gone missing. 3 days of fruitless searching, of hoping against hope. "Roger that. I'll head to Morro Rock now. Keep me posted on any developments." He grabbed his gear and headed out, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. As he drove through the winding roads of Sequoia National Park, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. At the base of Morro Rock, a small crowd of tourists had gathered, their excited chatter a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. "All right, folks," Thompson called out, his voice carrying the authority of years on the job. "I need everyone to clear the area. We've got a potentially dangerous situation here." As he ushered the tourists away, a middle-aged woman approached. Her face etched with concern. "Ranger," she said, her voice low. "That bear, it didn't look right. Its behavior was erratic." "And I could have sworn I saw blood on its fur." Thompson's stomach clenched. "Thank you, ma'am. We'll handle it from here. Please return to your vehicle." Once the area was clear, Thompson radioed for backup. If this bear was injured or had indeed attacked someone, it would be even more dangerous than usual. As he waited, Thompson scanned the tree line, his hand resting on his tranquilizer gun. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of wildlife eerily absent. A rustle in the underbrush caught his attention. Thompson froze, his eyes locked on the spot. Slowly, deliberately, a massive black bear emerged from the trees. The woman had been right. Its fur was matted with what looked disturbingly like blood, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. It swayed on its feet, as if dizzy or disoriented. Thompson raised his radio to his lips, speaking in a low, urgent tone. "I've got eyes on the bear. It's showing signs of aggression and possible injury, requesting immediate assistance." The bear's head swiveled towards him, nostrils flaring. Thompson's finger tightened on the trigger of his tranquilizer gun, but he held his fire. At this distance, agitating the bear further could be disastrous. Suddenly, the bear reared up on its hind legs, letting out a roar that seemed to shake the very air. Thompson's training took over. He fired, the tranquilizer dart finding its mark in the bear's shoulder. But instead of slowing the animal down, it seemed to enrage it further. The bear charged, covering the distance between them with terrifying speed. Thompson turned and ran, his heart pounding in his ears. He could hear the bear's heavy breathing behind him, feel the vibration of its footfalls in the earth. Just as he thought his lungs would burst, Thompson spotted a maintenance shed ahead. He put on a final burst of speed, practically throwing himself through the door and slamming it shut behind him. The entire structure shook as the bear slammed into it. Thompson wedged himself against the door, praying the flimsy wood would hold, as the bear continued its assault on the shed. Thompson's radio crackled to life. "Thompson, what's your status? We're 5 minutes out." He fumbled for the radio, his hands shaking. "Bear is highly aggressive. I'm trapped in the maintenance shed. Hanihimoro Rock, it's trying to break in. Hurry!" The minutes crawled by, each feeling like an eternity. The bear's attacks on the shed grew more frenzied, the wood splintering under its powerful blows. Just as Thompson thought the door would give way, he heard the blessed sound of vehicles approaching. Shouts filled the air, followed by the pop of a flare gun. The assault on the shed ceased abruptly. Thompson sagged against the door, relief washing over him in waves. "Thompson!" a voice called out. "You okay in there?" He opened the door cautiously, blinking in the sudden sunlight. His fellow rangers surrounded him, their weapons trained on the tree line where the bear had disappeared. "I'm all right," he managed, his voice hoarse. "But that bear, something's not right with it." As the team regrouped, discussing their next move, a call came in over the radio that made Thompson's blood run cold. "We've got a survivor. Repeat, we've found one of the missing hikers." Everything after that was a blur of activity. Thompson insisted on joining the rescue team despite his colleagues' concerns. As they raced to the location, his mind was racing. If one survived, could the others? They found her near the base of a massive sequoia, Sarah Mitchell according to her ID. She was dehydrated, covered in scratches and bruises, but alive. As the medics tended to her, Sarah's eyes locked onto Thompson. "The others," she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My friends, are they—" Thompson knelt beside her, his heart heavy. "We're still looking for them," he said gently. "Can you tell us what happened?" Sarah's story came out in bits and pieces as they transported her to safety. A bear attack at their campsite, getting separated in the chaos. Days of wandering, lost and afraid. "The bear," she said, her eyes haunted. "It kept finding us, following us. It was like it was hunting us." Thompson exchanged glances with his colleagues. Could it be the same bear he had encountered? The thought sent a chill down his spine. Back at headquarters, as Sarah was reunited with her frantic parents, Thompson pulled his team together. "All right, listen up," he said, his voice grave. "We've got 3 hikers still missing, and a potentially rabid bear out there. This just became a whole new ball game." Maps were spread out, search grids redrawn. Every available ranger was called in, along with volunteer search and rescue teams. As night fell, Thompson found himself back in the forest, leading a search party. The darkness seemed to press in around them, the beams of their flashlights barely penetrating the gloom. "Keep your eyes peeled," he called out to his team, "and stay alert. That bear could be anywhere." They trudged on through the night, calling out for the missing hikers, their voices echoing eerily through the trees. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set them on edge. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Thompson's radio crackled to life. "We've got something near Hospital Rock. Looks like—" "Oh God." Thompson's heart sank. "Report, what have you found?" There was a pause filled only with static. Then, "We've found another of the hikers, male, early 20s. He didn't—" "Fake it, Thompson." The news hit like a physical blow. Thompson closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of grief. Then, steeling himself, he turned to his team. "Let's move out. We've still got 2 more to find." The day wore on, the beauty of the forest now tainted by the knowledge of the tragedy unfolding within it. Every hour that passed diminished the chances of finding the remaining hikers alive. As the sun began to set once more, Thompson's team reached a small clearing. The stillness of the air, the unnatural quiet, immediately put him on alert. "Spread out," he whispered to his team, "and be ready for anything." They had barely taken a few steps when a scream pierced the air, human, terrified, and close. "This way," Thompson shouted, all caution forgotten as they raced towards the sound. They burst through the tree line into another clearing. The scene that greeted them would stay with Thompson for the rest of his life. The missing hikers, a young man and woman, were trapped on a rocky outcropping, and at the base of the rocks, rearing up on its hind legs, was the bear. Time seemed to slow down. Thompson raised his rifle, knowing he had only one shot at this. The bear's massive form filled his sight. He took a breath, steadied his aim, and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the forest. The bear roared in pain and fury, whirling to face this new threat. For a moment its eyes locked with Thompson's, and he saw something there that chilled him to his core. Not just animal instinct, but a malevolent intelligence. Then the bear charged, its injured state doing little to slow its terrifying speed. Thompson's team opened fire, the sound of gunshots shattering the evening calm. The bear stumbled, faltered, but kept coming. It was almost upon them when a final shot rang out. The massive animal crashed to the ground mere feet from where Thompson stood, sliding to a stop in a cloud of dust and leaves. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, cautiously, Thompson approached the fallen bear. Its chest heaved once, twice, and then was still. As his team rushed to help the stranded hikers, Thompson stood over the bear's body, a mix of emotions churning within him. Relief, sadness, and a deep abiding respect for the raw power of nature. In the days that followed, as the full story of the hiker's ordeal came to light, Thompson found himself reflecting on the fine line between civilization and wilderness. The forest, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, had claimed a life and forever changed others. As he watched Sarah and her surviving friends prepare to leave the park, Thompson approached them one last time. "I know this experience has been traumatic," he said, choosing his words carefully, "but I hope it doesn't turn you away from nature entirely. The forest can be dangerous, yes, but it's also a place of wonder and renewal. Just respect it. Prepare properly, and never forget that out here we're not at the top of the food chain." Sarah nodded, her eyes distant. "I don't think I could forget if I tried," she said softly. Then, to Thompson's surprise, she managed a small smile. "But you're right. Someday, I think I'd like to come back. To face it again, on its own terms." As they drove away, Thompson turned back to the forest. The great sequoias stood silent and eternal, guardians of a world both beautiful and brutal. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his responsibility settle over him once more. The forest would always be here, wild and untamed, and he would be here too, helping others navigate the delicate balance between experiencing its wonders and respecting its dangers. It was more than a job, it was a calling. And despite the tragedies, despite the dangers, Thompson knew he wouldn't have it any other way. Sarah's legs trembled with exhaustion as she climbed the steep, rocky slope. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but the memory of the bear's hot breath on her neck spurred her onward. She could hear it crashing through the underbrush below, its powerful form undeterred by the difficult terrain. Come on," she muttered to herself, her voice barely a whisper. Her throat was parched, her lips cracked from dehydration. How long had she been running? Hours? Days? Time had lost all meaning in her desperate flight. The trees thinned as she ascended, offering glimpses of the vast forest stretching out below. Under different circumstances, the view would have been breathtaking. Now it only served to emphasize how hopelessly lost she was. A roar echoed up the slope, closer than she'd expected. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She scrambled faster, her hands bloody from gripping sharp rocks. Suddenly the ground gave way beneath her feet. Sarah cried out as she slid several feet down the slope, scrabbling for purchase on the loose shale. She came to a stop at the edge of a sheer drop, rocks clattering into the abyss beyond. For a moment she lay there, gasping for breath, the world spinning around her. Then she heard it, the heavy breathing of the bear mere yards away. Sarah pushed herself up, ignoring the sharp pain in her ankle. She was trapped between the approaching predator and the cliff edge. Her mind raced, searching desperately for a way out. That's when she saw it, a narrow ledge hugging the cliff face, leading to what looked like a small cave opening. It was a risky move, but she was out of options. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to inch her way along the ledge. The rock face was rough against her back, loose pebbles skittering off the edge with each careful step. She forced herself not to look down, focusing instead on the cave entrance that seemed impossibly far away. A crash behind her told her the bear had reached the spot where she'd fallen. Sarah risked a glance back and immediately wished she hadn't. The massive animal stood at the edge of the slope, its dark eyes fixed on her with terrifying intelligence. "Stay back," Sarah whispered, as if the bear could understand her. "Please, just stay back." For a moment it seemed like her plea might be answered. The bear hesitated, pawing at the ground and sniffing the air. Then, with a low growl that Sarah felt in her bones, it began to move onto the ledge. Panic surged through her. Sarah abandoned caution, moving as quickly as she dared along the narrow path. The cave entrance loomed closer, promising at least temporary safety. Just as she thought she might make it, her injured ankle gave way. Sarah stumbled, her balance thrown off. For one heart-stopping moment, she teetered on the edge of the precipice. Then, she was falling. A scream torn from her throat as the world tilted crazily around her. Her hands flailed, seeking anything to stop her plunge. By some miracle, her fingers found a crack in the rock face. Pain shot through her arm as she jerked to a stop, dangling over the abyss. Above her, she could hear the bear's confused grunts as it tried to locate its vanished prey. Sarah hung there, every muscle trembling with the effort of holding on. She knew she couldn't last long like this. With agonizing slowness, she began to pull herself up, inch by excruciating inch, as her head cleared the ledge. She found herself face to face with the bear. It reared up on its hind legs, letting out a roar that seemed to shake the very mountain. In that moment, something in Sarah snapped. All the fear, all the desperation of the past days crystallized into a white-hot fury. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she hauled herself onto the ledge and stood facing the bear. "Enough!" she screamed, her voice raw and primal. "You want me? Come and get me!" The bear seemed taken aback by this sudden show of aggression. It dropped back to all fours, regarding Sarah with what almost looked like uncertainty. Sarah didn't wait to see what it would do next. She turned and sprinted the last few feet to the cave entrance, ducking inside just as the bear lunged for her. The interior of the cave was pitch black and surprisingly deep. Sarah stumbled forward, her hands outstretched to feel her way. Behind her, she could hear the bear's claws scrabbling at the cave entrance, its bulk too large to fit through the narrow opening. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Sarah realized the cave was more than just a shallow recess in the cliff face. A tunnel stretched before her, leading deeper into the mountain. For a moment she hesitated. Who knew what other dangers might lurk in the darkness? But the sounds of the frustrated bear behind her made the decision for her. Taking a deep breath, Sarah plunged into the tunnel. She walked for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing in around her. The tunnel twisted and turned, sometimes so narrow she had to turn sideways to squeeze through, other times opening into caverns so vast she couldn't see the walls. Just as Sarah was beginning to fear she'd be trapped in this lightless labyrinth forever, she saw a glimmer ahead. Hope surged through her as she quickened her pace. The tunnel opened out onto a ledge overlooking a vast underground chamber. Shafts of sunlight streamed down from cracks in the ceiling far above, illuminating a scene that took Sarah's breath away. Underground river flowed through the center of the cavern, its waters glittering in the diffused light. The walls were alive with color, streaks of minerals painting the rock in shades of red, gold, and blue. But what truly caught Sarah's attention was the far end of the cavern. There, carved into the rock face, was what looked like an ancient staircase leading up to a narrow fissure, a way out. Sarah's elation was short-lived, however. As she started to make her way down to the cavern floor, a low growl echoed through the chamber. She froze, her blood running cold. From a shadowy alcove emerged the bear. Somehow it had found another way into the cavern, It stood between Sarah and her only route of escape, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. "No," Sarah whispered, despair threatening to overwhelm her. "No, please, not now, not when I'm so close." The bear began to advance, its massive form reflected in the still pools of water dotting the cavern floor. Sarah backed away, her mind racing. She was exhausted, injured, and unarmed. There was no way she could outrun or outfight this relentless predator. As she retreated, her foot struck something, a loose rock about the size of a softball. Without thinking, Sarah scooped it up. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The bear charged, covering the distance between them with frightening speed. Sarah waited until the last possible moment, then hurled the rock with all her might. Her aim was true. The rock struck the bear squarely between the eyes, causing it to rear back with a roar of pain and surprise. Sarah didn't wait to see what would happen next. She sprinted past the stunned animal, making a beeline for the stone staircase. She took the steps 2 at a time, her lungs burning, her legs feeling like lead. Behind her, she could hear the bear recovering, its angry bellows echoing off the cavern walls. Sarah reached the fissure at the top of the stairs, a narrow crack that she'd have to squeeze through sideways. She began to edge her way in, the rough stone scraping her arms and face. Just as she thought she was safe, she felt a searing pain in her leg. The bear had reached the top of the stairs, its claws raking across her calf as it tried to pull her back. Sarah screamed in pain and terror, kicking out blindly. Her foot connected with something soft, the bear's sensitive nose. It let out a yelp of pain, releasing its grip just long enough for Sarah to pull herself fully into the fissure. She half crawled, half fell through the narrow passageway, emerging into blinding sunlight. Sarah found herself on a small ledge high up on the mountainside. Below her, the forest stretched out as far as the eye could see. Above, the clear blue sky promised freedom. Behind her, she could hear the bear's frustrated roars as it tried to follow, its bulk too large for the narrow gap. Sarah allowed herself to collapse, sobs of relief and pain racking her body. As the adrenaline faded, the full extent of her injuries made themselves known. Her leg was bleeding freely where the bear had clawed her, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. But she was alive. Against all odds, she had survived. As Sarah lay there, catching her breath, and watching the sun begin its descent towards the horizon, she heard a sound that made her heart leap, the distant thrum of helicopter blades. She looked up to see a search and rescue chopper passing overhead. With the last of her strength, Sarah pulled herself to her feet and began to wave frantically. "Here!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "I'm here! Help!" The helicopter banked, turning back towards her position. As it drew closer, Sarah saw a figure, leaning out, waving back at her. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as the reality of her rescue began to sink in. She was going home. She had faced the wilderness at its most brutal and survived. As the helicopter maneuvered into position to winch her to safety, Sarah cast one last look back at the mountain that had nearly claimed her life. In the fading light, she thought she saw a dark shape moving among the trees far below. The bear returning to the depths of the forest. A strange mix of emotions washed over her, fear, respect, and something else she couldn't quite name. The wilderness had tested her to her very limits, shown her terror beyond anything she'd ever known. But it had also revealed a strength within herself that she never knew existed. As the rescue worker helped secure her into the harness, Sarah knew that this experience would stay with her forever. She had entered these woods a naive college student. Sure of her place in the world, she would leave forever changed, carrying with her a newfound respect for the raw power of nature and a deeper understanding of her own resilience. The helicopter lifted off, carrying her away from the vast, indifferent wilderness that had nearly claimed her. But even as relief flooded through her, Sarah felt a tug of something unexpected, a desire to return someday, not out of bravado or naivety, but with proper respect and preparation, to face the wilderness again, older and wiser, and to write a new chapter in her story. For now, though, as the great sequoias receded beneath her and the lights of civilization beckoned on the horizon, Sarah closed her eyes. She was going home, carrying the wilderness within her, forever changed by her brush with the wild heart of nature. The rhythmic thump of helicopter blades cut through the mountain air as the rescue team scanned the dense forest below. Ranger. Thompson leaned out the open door, his eyes straining for any sign of movement among the sea of green. "There," he suddenly shouted, pointing to a small clearing. "I see something." The pilot banked sharply, circling lower. As they approached, the shape resolved into a figure waving frantically. "It's her," Thompson breathed, relief washing over him. "We found her." The helicopter hovered as Thompson and a paramedic prepared to descend. Wind whipped around them as they were lowered on the rescue harness, the ground rising up to meet them. Sarah. Mitchell stood swaying on her feet, her clothes torn and dirty, her face a mask of exhaustion and disbelief. As Thompson's feet touched the ground, he saw the raw emotion in her eyes, hope warring with the fear that this might all be a mirage. "Sarah?" he called out, approaching her slowly. "I'm Ranger Thompson. We're here to take you home." A sob escaped her as she stumbled forward. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thompson caught her as her legs gave way. "It's over," he assured her. "You're safe now." The paramedic rushed forward, quickly assessing Sarah's condition. "Multiple lacerations, signs of dehydration and exhaustion," he reported. "Possible ankle sprain. We need to get her to a hospital." As they secured Sarah into the rescue harness, Thompson noticed her gaze fixed on the tree line. He followed her, line of sight, but saw nothing but shadows among the trunks. "Sarah," he asked gently, "what is it?" She shook her head, as if coming out of a trance. "The bear," she murmured. It was right there." Thompson's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but the forest remained still. "Let's get you out of here," he said, helping to clip her into the harness. As they were winched up, Sarah's grip on Thompson's arm was almost painful. He could feel her trembling, whether from cold, exhaustion, or lingering fear, he couldn't tell. Once safely aboard, the paramedic immediately went to work, starting an IV and checking Sarah's vitals. Thompson knelt beside her, speaking in soothing tones as the helicopter banked towards civilization. "You're going to be all right," he assured her. "Can you tell me what happened? Where are the others?" Sarah's eyes, which had been drifting closed, snapped open. "The others?" she gasped, trying to sit up. "Oh God, Mike and Ethan. Are they—" Thompson gently eased her back down. "We're still looking for them," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Any information you can give us will help." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she recounted the harrowing tale. The initial bear attack at their campsite, getting separated in the chaos, days of wandering lost in the wilderness. "The bear," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It kept finding us, following us. It was like it was hunting us." Thompson exchanged a glance with the paramedic. The story seemed fantastical, but the genuine terror in Sarah's eyes was undeniable. "You're safe now," Thompson repeated, squeezing her hand. "Try to rest. We'll be at the hospital soon." As Sarah drifted into an exhausted sleep, Thompson moved to the cockpit, radioing into base. "We've got Sarah Mitchell," he reported. "She's alive but in rough shape. No sign of the other two yet." "Roger that," came the reply. "We're expanding the search grid now. And Thompson, there's been another bear attack reported near Morrow Rock. Tourist got some photos. You're going to want to see these." Thompson's stomach clenched. "Copy that. We'll drop off our rescue and I'll head there directly." The next few hours passed in a blur. After ensuring Sarah was safely in the hands of the medical team, Thompson raced to Morrow Rock. The photos the tourist had captured made his blood run cold. A massive black bear, far larger than was typical for the region, its fur matted, with what looked disturbingly like blood. "It matches Sarah's description," he muttered, studying the images. But how could one bear cover so much ground? As night fell, Thompson found himself back in the forest, leading a search party. The darkness seemed to press in around them, the beams of their flashlights barely penetrating the gloom. "Keep your eyes peeled," he called out to his team, "and stay alert. That bear could be anywhere." They trudged on through the night, calling out for the missing hikers, their voices echoing eerily through the trees. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set them on edge. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Thompson's radio crackled to life. "We've got something. Near Hospital Rock. Looks like—" Oh God, Thompson's heart sank. "Report. What have you found?" There was a pause, filled only with static. "Then we found another of the hikers. Male, early 20s. He didn't make it, Thompson." The news hit like a physical blow. Thompson closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of grief. Then, steeling himself, he turned to his team. "Let's move out. We've still got one more to find." They arrived at Hospital Rock to find a grim scene. Mike's body lay crumpled at the base of a large boulder, his backpack a few feet away, its contents strewn about as if ransacked. As the coroner examined the body, Thompson surveyed the area. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. The claw marks on the trees, the way the ground was torn up, it all spoke of a ferocity beyond normal bear behavior. "What the hell happened out here?" he muttered. A shout from one of his team members snapped him out of his thoughts. "Ranger Thompson, we've got tracks." Thompson jogged over, his heart racing. The tracks were unmistakably bear, but the size— "That can't be right," he breathed, crouching down to examine them more closely. "Sir?" one of the younger rangers asked, her voice tinged with fear. "What are we dealing with here?" Thompson stood, his face grim. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it is, we need to find it before it finds our last missing hiker." They followed the tracks deeper into the forest, the unnatural silence setting everyone on edge. As they entered a small clearing, Thompson held up a hand, signaling the team to stop. There in the soft earth was a clear human footprint, fresh, heading east. "It's Ethan," Thompson said, hope rising in his chest. "He's alive and he can't be far." They quickened their pace, following the trail of footprints. But with each step, Thompson's unease grew. Interspersed with Ethan's tracks were those of the bear, as if predator and prey were locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air, human, terrified, and close. "This way," Thompson shouted, all caution forgotten as they raced towards the sound. They burst through the tree line into another clearing. The scene that greeted them would stay with Thompson for the rest of his life. Ethan was trapped on a rocky outcropping, his face a mask of terror. And at the base of the rocks, rearing up on its hind legs, was the bear. It was massive, far larger than any black bear Thompson had ever seen. Its fur was matted and scarred, its eyes gleaming with an almost human intelligence. Time seemed to slow down. Thompson raised his rifle, knowing he had only one shot at this. The bear's massive form filled his sight. He took a breath, steadied his aim, and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the forest. The bear roared in pain and fury, whirling to face this new threat. For a moment, its eyes locked with Thompson's, and he saw something there that chilled him to his core. Not just animal instinct, but a malevolent intelligence. Then the bear charged, its injured state doing little to slow its terrifying speed. Thompson's team opened fire, the sound of gunshots shattering the evening calm. The bear stumbled, faltered, but kept coming. It was almost upon them when a final shot rang out. The massive animal crashed to the ground mere feet from where Thompson stood, sliding to a stop in a cloud of dust and leaves. For a long moment no one moved. Then slowly, cautiously, Thompson approached the fallen bear. Its chest heaved once, twice, and then was still. As his team rushed to help Ethan down from his perch, Thompson stood over the bear's body, a mix of emotions churning within him. Relief, sadness, and a deep, abiding respect for the raw power of nature. In the days that followed, as the full story of the hiker's ordeal came to light, Thompson found himself reflecting on the fine line between civilization and wilderness. The forest, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, had claimed a life and forever changed others. As he watched Sarah and Ethan prepare to leave the park, Thompson approached them one last time. "I know this experience has been traumatic," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But I hope it doesn't turn you away from nature entirely. The forest can be dangerous, yes, but it's also a place of wonder and renewal. Just respect it, prepare properly, and never forget that out here, we're not at the top of the food chain." Sarah nodded, her eyes distant. "I don't think I could forget if I tried," she said softly. Then, to Thompson's surprise, she managed a small smile. "But you're right. Someday I think I'd like to come back, to face it again, on its own terms." As they drove away, Thompson turned back to the forest. The great sequoias stood silent and eternal, guardians of a world both beautiful and brutal. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his responsibility settle over him once more. The forest would always be here, wild and untamed, and he would be here too, helping others navigate the delicate balance between experiencing its wonders and respecting its dangers. It was more than a job, it was a calling. And despite the tragedies, despite the dangers, Thompson knew he wouldn't have it any other way. The official report of the Sequoia National Park bear attack incident, as compiled by park rangers and wildlife management officials, paints a harrowing picture of survival against overwhelming odds. The events that unfolded over the course of 4 days in the summer of 2025 would forever change the lives of 4 college students and challenge the park's wildlife management protocols. Sarah Mitchell, the primary survivor and key witness, provided a detailed account of the encounters that would come to be known as the Sequoia Stalker case. Her testimony, along with physical evidence and corroborating statements from rescue personnel, forms the basis of this report. The first encounter occurred at the group's campsite on the evening of July 15th. What began as a typical camping trip for Sarah and her friends, Jess, Mike, and Ethan, quickly descended into terror when their site was invaded by an unusually aggressive black bear. "We thought we'd done everything right," Sarah recalled during her initial interview. "But when that bear came into our camp, it was like it knew exactly what it was doing. It wasn't just looking for food, it was hunting us." The bear's behavior, as described by Sarah, deviated significantly from typical black bear encounters. Its persistence and apparent targeting of the campers raised immediate concerns among wildlife officials. The second encounter, dubbed the Lookout Tower Siege, occurred approximately 36 hours after the initial attack. Sarah, separated from her friends, sought refuge in an abandoned fire lookout tower. The bear's relentless pursuit and its ability to partially climb the structure demonstrated a level of determination rarely seen in wildlife attacks. Sarah's voice trembled as she recounted the experience. "I could hear it below me, trying to find a way up. The whole tower was shaking. I really thought that was the end." The tension in Sarah's narrative was palpable, her words painting a vivid picture of primal fear and desperation. The psychological impact of being hunted, of being reduced to prey, was evident in every aspect of her retelling. The third encounter, the forest chase, pushed Sarah to her physical and mental limits. For hours, she fled through the dense sequoia forest, the bear in constant pursuit. This phase of the ordeal demonstrated the animal's unusual stamina and tracking ability. "It was like it could smell my fear," Sarah said, her eyes distant as she recalled the chase. "Every time I thought I'd lost it, every time I stopped to catch my breath, I'd hear it crashing through the trees behind me. It just wouldn't give up." Wildlife experts were particularly troubled by this aspect of Sarah's story. The sustained pursuit over such a long period is highly atypical for black bears, which generally lose interest in fleeing targets relatively quickly. The final encounter, the mountain showdown, brought the horrifying series of events to a climactic conclusion. Trapped on a narrow mountain ledge, Sarah found herself in a final confrontation with the bear that had stalked her for days. Her voice, barely above a whisper, Sarah described the moment. "I was sure this was it. I had nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. When I looked into its eyes, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't just an animal. There was something else there. Something intelligent. Something evil." The tension in this final encounter was almost unbearable. Sarah's description of facing down the bear, of finding a well of strength and defiance she didn't know she possessed, was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. "I don't know where it came from," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. "But suddenly, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. I screamed at it, challenged it, and for a moment, just a moment, it hesitated. That moment of hesitation, that brief display of dominance, may have saved Sarah's life. It bought her the precious seconds she needed to access the small cave that ultimately led to her rescue." The physical evidence collected at the various encounter sites corroborated Sarah's account in many ways. Claw marks found on trees and rocks were consistent with an unusually large black bear. Fur samples collected contained anomalies that are still being studied by wildlife biologists. The sheer distance covered by the animal during its pursuit of Sarah and her friends has led some experts to question whether they were dealing with a single bear or multiple animals. Perhaps most disturbing were the remains of Sarah's friend Mike, found near Hospital Rock. The manner of his death, the precision of the attack, suggested a level of predatory behavior rarely seen in black bears. This aspect of the case continues to be a source of debate and concern among wildlife management officials. The psychological impact on Sarah and the surviving members of her group cannot be overstated. In follow-up interviews, Sarah has displayed classic symptoms of PTSD, including hypervigilance, nightmares, and a persistent feeling of being watched or hunted. "Sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night," Sarah confessed during a recent check-in. "I can smell the forest, feel the ground shaking with each step of the bear. It's like I'm right back there running for my life." Yet, remarkably, Sarah has also expressed a desire to return to Sequoia National Park someday. This resilience, this determination to face her fears, has become a central focus of her ongoing therapy. "I don't want fear to be the end of my story with nature," she stated firmly. "What happened was terrible and I'll carry it with me forever. But the forest, the mountains, they're also beautiful and awe-inspiring. I want to be able to see that again, to feel that connection without the terror." The Sequoia stalker case has prompted a thorough review of wildlife management practices in the park. New protocols for tracking and monitoring potentially problematic bears have been implemented. Campsite regulations have been tightened, with a greater emphasis on proper food storage and bear awareness education for visitors. Despite these measures, an air of unease lingers over Sequoia National Park. Rangers report an increase in bear sighting calls, many of which turn out to be false alarms triggered by heightened visitor anxiety. The forest that once represented a peaceful retreat for many now carries an undercurrent of potential danger. As for the bear itself, or bears, depending on which theory one subscribes to, the case remains open. While one large black bear was killed during Sarah's rescue, evidence suggests it may not have been the same animal responsible for all 4 encounters. Ongoing genetic analysis of fur and tissue samples may yet yield answers, but for now, the full truth of what stalked Sarah Mitchell through the Sequoia forest remains a mystery. The tension between human visitors and wildlife in our national parks has always existed, a delicate balance between conservation and accessibility. The Sequoia stalker case has brought this tension into sharp focus, challenging our understanding of wildlife behavior and our place in these wild spaces. As Ranger Thompson, one of the key figures in Sarah's rescue, noted in his final report, "The forest doesn't care about our rules or expectations. It operates on its own terms, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Our job is to help people experience its wonders while respecting its dangers. The moment we forget that, the moment we take our safety for granted, is the moment we put ourselves at risk." The Sequoia stalker case serves as a stark reminder of this reality. It is a tale of survival against overwhelming odds, a testament to human resilience in the face of primal fear. But it is also a cautionary tale, a call for humility and respect when we venture into the wild places of our world. As Sarah Mitchell continues her recovery, as the forests of Sequoia National Park continue their eternal watch, the echoes of those 4 harrowing encounters linger. They serve as a powerful reminder that in the dance between civilization and wilderness, we are not always the leading partner. Sometimes, we are merely guests in a world far older and wilder than our own, where ancient rules still apply, and the line between predator and prey can shift in the blink of an eye. Now let's go to the next attack case. If you're enjoying it, leave a like and a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Let's move on to the next one. Frank Jacobs awoke before his alarm, the familiar anticipation of a hunt already coursing through his veins. He lay still for a moment, listening to the gentle snoring of his wife, Sarah, beside him. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room and the occasional creak of the old wooden structure settling. As he slowly sat up, careful not to disturb Sarah, Frank's eyes adjusted to the pre-dawn darkness. He could just make out the silhouette of his hunting gear, meticulously laid out the night before. With practiced silence, He slipped out of bed and padded across the cold wooden floor. In the bathroom, Frank splashed cold water on his face, the shock fully awakening his senses. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, weathered face, salt and pepper stubble, and eyes that held the wisdom of countless hunts in the Alaskan wilderness. At 52, he was no longer the young, brash hunter he once was, but experience had made him formidable in his own right. As he dressed in layers of warm camouflage clothing, Frank's mind wandered to the moose he'd been tracking for the past week. It was a magnificent bull, larger than any he'd seen in years. The thought of finally closing in on his quarry sent a thrill of excitement through him. In the kitchen, Frank brewed a strong pot of coffee, its rich aroma filling the small cabin. He poured himself a mug and stepped out onto the porch, inhaling deeply. The crisp Alaskan air bit at his nostrils, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. The forest before him was still shrouded in darkness, but he could sense the stirring of life within its depths. As he sipped his coffee, Sarah appeared in the doorway, wrapping a thick robe around herself. "You're up early," she said, her voice still husky with sleep. Frank turned and smiled at his wife of 30 years. "You know me. Can't sleep when there's a hunt on." Sarah stepped closer, concern etching her features. "I know, but—" "Be careful out there, Frank. Something feels different this time." He chuckled softly, pulling her into a warm embrace. "You say that every time, love. Don't worry, I'll be back before dark with enough meat to fill our freezer for months." She nodded against his chest, then pulled back to look him in the eye. "Just promise me you'll stay alert. The rangers mentioned increased bear activity in the area." "I always do," Frank assured her, planting a kiss on her forehead. "I've got my rifle, my knife, and decades of experience. No bear's going to get the drop on me." Sarah managed a small smile, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. "All right, go on then before I change my mind and chain you to the porch." With a final kiss, Frank stepped back into the cabin to gather his gear. He double-checked his backpack, first aid kit, extra ammunition, water, high-energy snacks, and a satellite phone for emergencies. His trusty rifle, a Remington 700 he'd had for over 2 decades, was cleaned and ready. As he shouldered his pack and picked up the rifle, Sarah appeared once more. "Frank?" she called softly. He turned to see her holding out a thermos, "Some extra coffee for the trail, and please check in when you can." Frank nodded, taking the thermos gratefully. "Will do. I love you, Sarah." "I love you too. Happy hunting." With that, Frank stepped off the porch and into the awakening forest. The first hints of dawn were starting to lighten the eastern sky, but the woods were still deep in shadow. Frank clicked on his headlamp, its beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating the path ahead. He set a brisk pace, his boots crunching softly on the leaf-strewn ground. The familiar sounds and scents of the forest enveloped him, the distant call of a loon, the musty smell of decaying leaves, the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Frank felt his muscles warming up, his body falling into the rhythm of the hike. As he walked, his mind focused on the task ahead. The moose he was tracking was big, easily over 1,000 pounds. Its rack had been impressive. He estimated at least a 60-inch spread. Taking down such a beast would require skill, patience, and more than a little luck. After about an hour of hiking, the forest began to lighten as dawn broke. Frank paused to take a drink from his water bottle and survey his surroundings. He was deep in the Chugach National Forest now, surrounded by towering spruce and hemlock trees. The undergrowth was thick, providing ample cover for wildlife and ample obstacles for hunters. Frank knelt to examine the ground, searching for signs of his quarry. It didn't take long to spot fresh tracks, the distinctive heart-shaped imprints of a large moose. His pulse quickened as he realized they couldn't be more than a few hours old. "There you are, you big bastard," he muttered to himself, a grin spreading across his face. He began to follow the tracks, moving with increased caution. Every step was carefully placed to minimize noise, every movement slow and deliberate. Frank's senses were on high alert, his eyes constantly scanning the forest around him for any sign of movement. As the morning wore on, Frank could sense he was getting close. The tracks were fresher, the broken branches and disturbed vegetation more recent. He paused frequently, listening intently for any sound that might betray the moose's location. It was during one of these pauses that Frank noticed something odd. Mixed in with the moose tracks were other prints, large five-toed tracks with visible claw marks. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized them. Bear tracks, and big ones at that. "Shit," Frank whispered, his earlier excitement now tinged with caution. He straightened up slowly, eyes darting around the forest. The woods suddenly seemed more ominous, the shadows deeper and more threatening. He debated turning back. The sensible thing would be to abort the hunt, to return when the bear had moved on. But the thought of that magnificent moose so close made him hesitate. He'd come this far. Frank tightened his grip on his rifle and pressed on, following the intermingled tracks of moose and bear. His movements were even more cautious now, every sense straining for any sign of danger. The trail led him to the edge of a small clearing. Frank crouched behind a fallen log, scanning the open space. His heart leapt as he spotted movement on the far side, the unmistakable shape of a massive bull moose, partially obscured by the undergrowth. Frank raised his rifle, peering through the scope. The moose was even more impressive than he'd imagined, its antlers a majestic crown atop its massive head. He steadied his breathing, finger resting lightly on the trigger. But before he could take the shot, a sound froze him in place, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Frank's blood ran cold as he slowly lowered his rifle and turned his head. There, not 20 yards away, stood a brown bear of monstrous proportions. It was up on its hind legs, easily 9 feet tall, its black eyes fixed squarely on Frank. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, man and bear stared at each other, neither moving. Then, with a roar that shook the forest, the bear dropped to all fours and charged. Frank's world exploded into chaos. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging through his body. The moose, startled by the bear's roar, crashed off into the forest, but Frank had no time to mourn his lost quarry. He was now the prey. He raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare the bear off. The massive animal hesitated for a split second, but then renewed its charge with even greater fury. Frank turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. Branches whipped at his face, roots threatened to trip him, but pure survival instinct kept him moving. The bear's heavy breathing and the sound of breaking vegetation told him it was right behind him. As he ran, Sarah's words echoed in his mind. Something feels different this time. How right she had been. Frank had always prided himself on his woodcraft, on his ability to read the forest and its inhabitants. But he'd underestimated the danger, had been too focused on his prize. Now, as he fled for his life through the Alaskan wilderness, Frank Jacobs realized that the hunter had become the hunted. And in that moment, as the bear's roars filled his ears and fear clutched at his heart, he wondered if he would live to see another dawn. Frank's lungs burned as he crashed through the underbrush, the bear's thunderous footfalls echoing behind him. His mind raced, searching for a plan, any way to escape the fury of the massive predator. The forest, once so familiar, now seemed alien and hostile, every tree a potential obstacle, every shadow a new threat. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately regretted it. The bear was closer than he'd thought, its massive form barreling through the forest with terrifying ease. Frank could see the rage in its eyes, the gleam of its yellowed teeth. "Come on, old man," Frank muttered, to himself, pushing his legs to move faster. "I've got more fight in you than this." His foot caught on a hidden root and Frank went sprawling. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. His rifle clattered away, sliding down a small embankment. For a horrifying moment, Frank thought it was over. He could hear the bear closing in, its hot breath almost on his neck, but survival instinct took over. Frank rolled, narrowly avoiding the bear's first swipe. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain shooting through his ankle. The bear roared in frustration, rearing up on its hind legs. Frank's eyes darted around, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. His gaze fell on a thick branch lying nearby. He lunged for it, his fingers closing around the rough bark just as the bear charged again. With all his strength, Frank swung the branch, connecting solidly with the bear's snout. The impact sent shockwaves up his arms, but it had the desired effect. The bear recoiled, shaking its massive head in confusion and pain. Frank didn't wait to see if it would recover. He turned and ran again, his eyes scanning the forest floor for any sign of his lost rifle. His ankle throbbed with each step, but adrenaline dulled the pain. He could hear the bear crashing through the undergrowth behind him, its roars a mixture of rage and frustration. "Where are you? Where are you?" Frank hissed, desperate to spot his weapon. The forest floor was a chaotic mess of leaves, branches, and shadows, making it nearly impossible to distinguish anything. A glint of metal caught his eye. There, lodged against a fallen log, was his rifle. Frank's heart leapt. If he could reach it, he might have a chance. He changed direction, angling towards the weapon. The bear, sensing his shift, let out another ear-splitting roar. Frank could feel the ground trembling beneath its charge. "Come on, come on!" Frank urged himself, pushing his battered body to its limits. He was only a few yards from the rifle. Now. The bear was closing fast, its massive paws tearing up the earth with each stride. Frank dove, his hand outstretched. His fingers closed around the familiar grip of his rifle just as he felt a searing pain across his back. The bear's claws had found their mark, tearing through his jacket and into flesh. Rolling onto his back, Frank brought the rifle up, aiming purely on instinct. The bear loomed over him, its jaws open wide, ready to deliver a killing blow. Frank squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out deafeningly loud in the confined space of the forest. The bear stumbled backward, more surprised than hurt. Frank's hands shook as he worked the bolt, chambering another round. He fired again and again, each shot driving the bear further back. After the fourth shot, the massive animal turned and lumbered away, disappearing into the thick underbrush. Its roars faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by Frank's ragged breathing. For several long moments, Frank lay there, his rifle clutched to his chest, ears, straining for any sign of the bear's return. Slowly, the normal sounds of the forest began to return, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant call of a loon. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, his voice shaky. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his back. He reached around, his hand coming away sticky with blood. The bear's claws had left deep gashes across his shoulder blades. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Frank forced himself to his feet. He swayed unsteadily, using his rifle as a makeshift crutch. His ankle, forgotten in the heat of the moment, now throbbed insistently. He was alive, but far from safe. Frank took stock of his situation. His pack was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos of the chase. With it went his first aid kit, his water, his food, and, most crucially, his satellite phone. He was injured, disoriented, and had no way to call for help. "Think, Frank, think," he muttered, trying to quell the rising panic in his chest. He needed to get his bearings, to figure out which direction would lead him back to the cabin, but the frantic chase had left him completely turned around. He closed his eyes, focusing on his years of experience in these woods. The sun. He could use the sun to orient himself. Frank looked up, searching for a break in the canopy. There, through a small gap in the leaves, he could see the sun's position. "Okay," he said to himself, his voice steadier now. "It's mid-morning. The sun's in the east. The cabin's roughly northwest from where I started this morning, so I need to keep the sun on my right and slightly behind me." With a direction in mind, Frank began to walk. Each step was a struggle, his body protesting. Every movement. The gashes on his back burned, and he could feel blood soaking through his torn jacket. His ankle threatened to give way with each step. As he limped through the forest, Frank's mind raced. The bear's behavior had been unusual. Brown bears, while certainly capable of aggression, typically avoided confrontations with humans. This one had been unusually persistent, almost territorial. "Could be a sow with cubs nearby," Frank mused aloud, his voice rough with exertion. "Or maybe it's sick, injured. Doesn't matter now, just got to focus on getting home." The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Every tree looked the same, every hill and valley blending into a green maze. Frank's steps grew slower, his breathing more labored. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He paused, leaning heavily against a tree. The world swam before his eyes, exhaustion and blood loss taking their toll. Frank shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his mind. "Come on, old man," he growled. "Sarah's waiting for you. You promised her you'd be back." The thought of his wife gave Frank a second wind. He pushed off from the tree, forcing his battered body to keep moving. He began to talk to himself, the sound of his voice a comfort in the oppressive silence of the forest. "One foot in front of the other, Frank. That's all you got to do. One step at a time. Sarah's probably got dinner waiting. Bet it's that venison stew you like. Can't let it go to waste, can you?" As he walked, Frank kept his eyes and ears open for any sign of the bear's return. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent a jolt of fear through him. But the massive predator didn't reappear. Hours passed, the sun slowly arcing across the sky. Frank's progress was agonizingly slow, each step a monumental effort. His throat was parched, his stomach cramping with hunger. The blood loss from his wounds left him light-headed and weak. Just as Frank felt he couldn't take another step, the trees ahead began to thin. He squinted, hardly daring to believe his eyes. There, through a gap in the foliage, he could see a plume of smoke rising into the sky. "The cabin," Frank whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Sarah." With renewed energy, Frank pushed forward. The trees gave way to the small clearing where their cabin stood. The sight of the familiar wooden structure, smoke curling from its chimney, was the most beautiful thing Frank had ever seen. He stumbled out of the tree line, his rifle slipping from his grasp. "Sarah!" he called, his voice weak but filled with relief. "Sarah, I'm home!" The cabin door flew open and Sarah rushed out. Her eyes widened in horror as she took in Frank's battered, bloody form. "Frank! Oh my God, Frank!" She ran to him, catching him just as his legs gave out. "What happened? You're hurt." Frank managed a weak smile, sagging against his wife's support. "Had a disagreement with a bear," he mumbled. "Think I lost the argument." Sarah's face paled, but her voice was steady as she helped Frank towards the cabin. "Let's get you inside. I'll call for help." As they crossed the threshold into the warmth and safety of their home, Frank felt the last of his strength leave him. The world tilted, growing dark around the edges. The last thing he heard before consciousness slipped away was Sarah's voice, strong and reassuring. "You're safe now, Frank. You're home. Everything's going to be okay." Then darkness claimed him. And Frank Jacobs knew no more. Frank's eyes snapped open, his heart racing. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was. The soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminated unfamiliar surroundings, stark white walls, the rhythmic beeping of machines, the antiseptic smell of disinfectant. "Hospital," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The events of the bear attack came flooding back, a jumble of terrifying images and sensations. "Frank?" "Oh, thank God." Sarah's face appeared above him, her eyes red-rimmed from crying but filled with relief. "You're awake. How do you feel?" Frank tried to sit up but immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his back. "Like I went 10 rounds with a grizzly," he groaned. "How long have I been out?" 2 days, Sarah replied, gently pushing him back onto the pillows. "The doctors had to sedate you to treat your injuries. You lost a lot of blood, Frank. They said—" Her voice caught. "They said we almost lost you." Frank reached out, taking his wife's hand in his. "I'm still here, love. Takes more than an oversized furball to take down Frank Jacobs." Sarah managed a watery smile, squeezing his hand. "Don't joke, Frank. When I saw you stumble out of the woods, covered in blood, I've never been so scared in my life." Before Frank could respond, the door opened and a doctor walked in, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Jacobs, good to see you awake. I'm Dr. Ramirez." "How are you feeling?" "Like death warmed over," Frank replied honestly. "What's the damage, Doc?" Dr. Ramirez consulted his chart. "You've got deep lacerations across your back. Those required quite a few stitches. Your left ankle is severely sprained, and you've got numerous contusions and minor cuts. You also lost a significant amount of blood, which is why you've been out for so long. But considering you went toe-to-toe with a brown bear, Mr. Jacobs, I'd say you're remarkably lucky." Frank snorted. "Lucky. Right. I mean it," the doctor said seriously. "Most people don't walk away from encounters like that. Now, I've got some questions about the attack if you're up for it. The wildlife authorities are very interested in what happened." Frank nodded, wincing as the movement sent a twinge of pain through his back. "Ask away, Doc." As Frank recounted the events of the attack, he found himself transported back to those terrifying moments in the forest. He could almost smell the bear's hot breath, hear its thunderous roars echoing through the trees. "And then I fired 4 shots, he concluded. "That finally drove it off. After that, it's all a bit of a blur until I made it back to the cabin." Dr. Ramirez nodded, making notes. "Remarkable. The Wildlife Service will want to speak with you directly once you're feeling up to it. They're concerned about the bear's unusually aggressive behavior." "Yeah, well, tell them to get in line," Frank grumbled. "I've got a few choice words for that bear myself." After the doctor left, promising to return later to check on Frank's wounds, Sarah settled into the chair beside the bed. "Frank," she said softly, "what were you thinking going after that bear?" Frank sighed, closing his eyes. "I wasn't thinking, Sarah. That's the problem. I was so focused on that damn moose, I ignored all the warning signs. I got cocky, thought. I was too experienced to get caught out like that. Nearly got myself killed because of it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "You promised me you'd be careful. You promised you'd come back." No, love, I'm sorry, Frank's words were cut off as a wave of pain washed over him. He gritted his teeth, riding it out. Sarah was immediately on her feet, concern etched on her face. "Should I call the nurse?" Frank shook his head, his breathing ragged. No, it's passing. Just give me a minute." As the pain subsided, Frank became aware of a new sensation, a creeping, insidious fear. The hospital room suddenly felt too small, too confining. He could almost hear the bear's roars echoing in his mind. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight, "I need to get out of here. I need to see the sky." Sarah looked uncertain. "Frank, you're in no condition to—" "Please," he interrupted, a note of desperation in his voice. Just help me to the window. I need to see outside." After a moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded. She helped Frank sit up, supporting him as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body, but Frank pushed through it, determined. With Sarah's help, he shuffled to the window, leaning heavily on her and the IV stand he was attached to. Sarah drew back the curtains, revealing a view of the hospital parking lot and beyond it, the edge of the forest. Frank pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line. The sight of the forest, once so inviting and full of promise, now filled him with a mixture of fear and shame. "I've spent my whole life in those woods," he murmured. "Thought I knew them inside and out. But out there, in that moment, I've never felt so small, so helpless." Sarah wrapped her arm around him, careful of his injuries. "You survived, Frank. That's what matters." Frank shook his head, his voice bitter. "I survived because I got lucky. If I'd been a little slower, if my rifle had been a little further away, I'd be nothing but bear food right now." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching as the wind rustled the distant trees. Frank's mind wandered back to the attack, replaying every moment in excruciating detail. The bear's roar, the burning in his lungs as he ran, the terror that had gripped him. A knock at the door startled them both. A nurse entered, carrying a tray of medical supplies. "Mr. Jacobs, it's time to change your dressings." As Sarah helped Frank back to the bed, he caught sight of himself in the room's small mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back at him, pale, haggard, with a wild look in his eyes. Was this what the bear had reduced him to? The process of changing. The dressings was agonizing. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through Frank's body, and the sight of his wounds, angry red gashes held together by neat rows of stitches, brought home the reality of how close he'd come to death. As the nurse worked, 2 men in ranger uniforms entered the room. "Mr. Jacobs, I'm Ranger Mike Holden, and this is my partner, Ranger Tom Chen. We're from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Do you feel up to answering a few questions about your encounter?" Frank nodded wearily. Might as well get it over with. For the next hour, Frank recounted his story once again, this time in painstaking detail. The rangers asked probing questions about the bear's behavior, its size, any distinguishing marks he might have noticed. "Based on your description," Ranger Holden said, We believe this might be a bear we've been tracking for a while. There have been other reports of unusually aggressive behavior. Great, Frank muttered. So I ran into the local psycho bear. Lucky me, Ranger Chen leaned forward, his expression serious. Mr. Jacobs, we can't stress enough how fortunate you are to have survived this encounter. This bear represents a significant threat to public safety. We're going to need to take action. Frank's eyes narrowed. What kind of action? The Rangers exchanged a glance. Given the bear's pattern of aggression, Ranger Holden said carefully, we may have no choice but to put it down. Frank felt a complicated mix of emotions at those words. Part of him, the part still gripped by terror and pain, felt a grim satisfaction. But another part, the part that had spent a lifetime respecting and admiring the wild creatures of the forest, recoiled at the thought. Is that really necessary? Sarah asked, voicing Frank's conflicted thoughts. Surely there are other options. Ranger Chen shook his head. We always prefer non-lethal methods when dealing with wildlife, Mrs. Jacobs. But in cases like this, where an animal has demonstrated repeated aggressive behavior towards humans, we have to prioritize public safety. As the Rangers continued to explain the situation, Frank found his attention drifting. His gaze was drawn back to the window, to the distant forest that had been his second home for so many years. He thought about the bear, not as the monstrous rage-filled creature that had nearly killed him, but as a wild animal acting on instinct. What had driven it to such aggressive behavior? Was it protecting its territory, its cubs? Or was it, like so many creatures in the rapidly changing Alaskan wilderness, simply struggling to survive in a world increasingly encroached upon by humans? Frank's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp pain in his back, a reminder of the very real consequences of his encounter. He turned back to the conversation, his mind churning with conflicting emotions. As the Rangers prepared to leave, promising to keep them updated on the situation, Frank spoke up. Wait, he said, his voice rough. Before you go, I want you to know something. The Rangers paused, looking at him expectantly. Frank took a deep breath, wincing at the pain it caused. That bear, it could have killed me. Should have killed me, but it didn't. I don't know why, but it gave me a chance. Maybe we owe it the same courtesy. The Rangers exchanged surprised glances. Ranger Holden nodded slowly. We'll take that into consideration, Mr. Jacobs. Thank you for your input. As the door closed behind them, Sarah turned to Frank, her expression a mixture of concern and admiration. Frank Jacobs, you never cease to amaze me. Frank managed a weak smile. Don't know if I'm being noble or just plain crazy, Sarah. But the thought of that bear being killed because of me, it doesn't sit right. Sarah took his hand, squeezing it gently. That's the man I married, always seeing the best in everything, even when it's tried to eat you. Frank chuckled, then groaned as the movement aggravated his wounds. As the pain subsided, he found himself yawning, the events of the day catching up with him. Get some rest, Sarah said, helping him settle back against the pillows. I'll be right here. As Frank drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled with images of the forest, not as a place of terror, but as the wild, beautiful home he had always known it to be. And somewhere in those dreams, a massive brown bear moved through the trees, not as a monster but as a fellow creature of the wilderness, each of them simply trying to survive in their own way. Frank gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles white with tension, as Sarah pushed him through the hospital's automatic doors. The late afternoon sun hit his face, and he squinted against its brightness. After a week in the sterile confines of the hospital, the outside world felt overwhelming. You okay? Sarah asked, sensing his unease. Frank nodded stiffly. Yeah, just give me a minute. As Sarah parked the wheelchair near their truck, Frank took deep breaths, trying to calm his racing heart. The parking lot was surrounded by trees, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. It was a sound he'd always found soothing, but now it set his nerves on edge. Frank, Sarah's voice was gentle. We don't have to do this today. We can go back inside if you're not ready. He shook his head firmly. No, I need to do this. I can't let fear keep me trapped in there. With Sarah's help, Frank slowly stood from the wheelchair. His back protested, the stitches pulling uncomfortably, but he gritted his teeth and endured it. Using a cane for support, he took a few tentative steps towards their truck. Each step was a battle, not just against the physical pain, but against the growing panic in his chest. The trees seemed to loom over him, their shadows stretching across the parking lot like grasping claws. "Easy, easy," Sarah murmured, her hand on his arm. "We're almost there." As they neared the truck, a loud crash from nearby sent Frank reeling. His cane clattered to the ground as he stumbled backwards, nearly falling if not for Sarah's quick reflexes. "It's okay," Sarah said quickly, supporting his weight. "It's just the dumpster lid. See? The wind caught it." Frank's breathing was rapid, his eyes wild as they darted around the parking lot. I can't," he gasped. "Shh, it's all right," Sarah soothed, helping him lean against the truck. "You're safe, I'm right here." It took several long minutes for Frank's panic to subside. When he finally regained his composure, shame washed over him. "Christ, Sarah," he muttered. "Look at me, jumping at shadows like some green kid on his first hunt." Sarah cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You listen to me, Frank Jacobs. You survived something that would have broken most men. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to need time to heal. Not just your body, but your mind too." Frank nodded, not trusting himself to speak. With Sarah's help, he managed to climb into the passenger seat of the truck. As they drove away from the hospital, Frank kept his eyes fixed on the dashboard, unable to look at the forest passing by outside. The drive home was tense and quiet. As they neared their cabin, Frank's anxiety ratcheted up again. The familiar dirt road, once a welcome sight after long days in the woods, now felt like a path into enemy territory. Sarah pulled up in front of the cabin and cut the engine. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "Home, sweet home," Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. Frank looked up at the cabin, their home for the past 30 years. It stood as it always had, a sturdy log structure nestled among the towering spruce trees. But now those same trees that had always represented comfort and adventure loomed menacingly. "I don't know if I can do this, Sarah," Frank admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah reached over, taking his hand in hers. "You can, we'll do it together, one step at a time." With Sarah's support, Frank made his way slowly up the porch steps. Each creak of the wood sent a jolt through him, his mind conjuring images of a massive bear lurking just out of sight. Inside, the cabin was exactly as they'd left it the day of the attack. Frank's hunting gear still lay neatly by the door, waiting. For an expedition that never happened, the sight of it made his stomach churn. "Why don't you sit down?" Sarah suggested, guiding him to his favorite armchair. "I'll make us some tea." As Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, Frank sat rigidly in the chair, his eyes fixed on the window. The forest pressed close, its dense foliage blocking out much of the fading daylight. A sharp knock at the door made Frank jump, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. "I've got it," Sarah called, hurrying to answer. Frank heard murmured voices. Then Sarah returned with Ranger Holden in tow. "Mr. Jacobs," the ranger greeted, his expression somber. "How are you feeling?" Frank managed a weak, "It's been better. Any news about our furry friend?" Ranger Holden pulled up a chair, his face grave. "That's why I'm here. We've been tracking the bear since your encounter. Well, the situation has escalated." Frank felt his chest tighten. "What do you mean, escalated?" The ranger sighed. "Heavily. There was another attack yesterday, a hiker about 10 miles from where you were ambushed. He didn't make it." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He slumped in his chair, a cold dread settling over him. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Ranger Holden continued, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Given this development, we have no choice. We're mounting an operation to locate and neutralize the bear." Frank closed his eyes, a war of emotions raging within him. Part of him felt a grim satisfaction. The bear that had nearly killed him, that had now taken an innocent life, would be stopped. But another part mourned for the wild creature, driven by instincts they couldn't hope to fully understand. "When?" Frank asked, opening his eyes to meet the ranger's gaze. "We're assembling the team now. We'll head out at first light tomorrow." Frank nodded slowly, a resolve forming in his mind. "I want to come with you." "Frank, no," Sarah protested immediately. "You're in no condition to—" "I have to, Sarah," Frank interrupted, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I need to see this through. I need to face this." Ranger Holden looked uncertain. "Mr. Jacobs, I understand your feelings, but given your injuries—" "I'm not asking to join the hunt," Frank clarified. "But I know these woods better than anyone. I can guide you to where I encountered the bear, show you signs I noticed, and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I need to do this. For my own peace of mind." The ranger considered for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But you stay with the base camp team. No going into the field, deal?" "Deal," Frank agreed. After Ranger Holden left, Sarah rounded on Frank, her eyes blazing. "Have you lost your mind? You can barely make it across the room without help, and now you want to go traipsing back into those woods?" Frank reached out, taking her hand. "Sarah, love, listen to me. I'm terrified. The thought of going back out there, it makes me want to curl up and hide. But if I don't face this fear now, it's going to consume me. I'll never be able to step foot outside this cabin again without seeing that bear around every corner." Sarah's anger deflated, replaced by worry. "I just got you back, Frank. I can't lose you again." "You won't," Frank promised, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "I'll be careful, but I need to do this." As night fell, Frank lay awake in bed, listening to Sarah's steady breathing beside him. His mind raced with memories of the attack, intermingled with anxiety about the coming day. In the dark, quiet cabin, Frank allowed himself to confront the fear that had been gnawing at him since he first saw the bear. It wasn't just the physical danger, the near-death experience. It was the shattering of the illusion of control, the realization that in the vast wilderness he thought he knew so well, he was ultimately just another vulnerable creature. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Frank made a silent vow. He would face this fear, confront the bear one last time, not as a hunter, not as prey, but as a man seeking to make peace with the wild, untamable nature of the world he loved. With that resolution firmly in mind, Frank carefully rose from the bed, wincing at the pain in his back. He dressed slowly, each movement a reminder of his brush with death. As he pulled on his boots, he caught sight of his reflection in the bedroom mirror. The man staring back at him was changed. Older, certainly, with new lines of pain and worry etched into his face. But there was something else too, a hardness in his eyes, a set to his jaw that spoke of determination. "One last hunt," Frank whispered to his reflection. "Let's finish this." The pre-dawn air was crisp and biting as Frank eased himself into the passenger seat of Ranger Holden's truck. His body protested every movement, a stark reminder of his recent ordeal. Sarah stood on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, worry etched deep in the lines of her face. "I'll be back before you know it," Frank called out, trying to inject confidence into his voice. Sarah managed a weak smile. "You better be, Frank Jacobs. Don't make me come looking for you." As the truck pulled away, Frank watched his wife's figure grow smaller in the side mirror. The knot of anxiety in his stomach tightened. Was he making a mistake? Should he be home recovering instead of heading back into the very forest that had nearly claimed his life? Ranger Holden seemed to sense his unease. "It's not too late to change your mind, Mr. Jacobs. No one would think less of you." Frank shook his head, his jaw set. "No, I need to do this, and please, call me Frank." The ranger nodded, turning his attention back to the road. As they drove deeper into the Chugach National Forest, Frank felt his heart rate increasing. Every shadow among the trees seemed to hide a lurking threat. He closed his eyes, taking deep breaths to calm himself. "We're almost at base camp, Ranger," Holden announced after about an hour of driving. "It's just over this next ridge." As they crested the hill, Frank saw a clearing filled with vehicles and tents. Park rangers and wildlife officials moved about with purpose, checking equipment and conferring in small groups. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the gravity of their mission. Ranger Chen approached as they parked, his face grim. "Glad you could make it, Frank. We've got some updates." Inside the main tent, maps were spread across a folding table. Red pins marked various locations, creating a disturbing pattern. "We've had 3 more sightings since yesterday," Ranger Chen explained. Pointing to the most recent markers, all consistent with the bear's description. It's moving in a clear pattern, circling back to this area. He tapped a spot on the map that made Frank's blood run cold. That's where it attacked me, Frank said softly. Ranger Holden nodded. It seems to be establishing a territory. Unfortunately, that territory includes several popular hiking trails and camping spots. Frank leaned in, studying the map intently. Despite his fear, years of experience as a hunter kicked in. He began to see the logic in the bear's movements, so the pattern in its behavior. Here, he said, pointing to a spot between two of the sightings, there's a series of caves in this area. If I were a bear looking for a den, that's where I'd go. The rangers exchanged impressed glances. Good eye. Frank, Ranger Chen said, we'll send a team to check it out. As the morning progressed, Frank found himself falling into a familiar rhythm. He pored over maps, shared his knowledge of the terrain, and helped the team strategize. For brief moments, he almost forgot his fear, lost in the familiar challenge of tracking a wild animal. But reality came crashing back when a commotion erupted outside the tent. Frank hobbled to the entrance, leaning heavily on his cane. A group of rangers were clustered around a newly arrived vehicle, their faces tense. What's going on? Frank asked Ranger Holden as he approached. The ranger's expression was grim. Another attack. A couple of hikers surprised the bear near a stream about 5 miles from here. One of them didn't make it, the others being airlifted to Anchorage as we speak. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. The beast that had nearly killed him had now claimed 2 lives. Any lingering doubts about the necessity of this mission evaporated. We're moving out, Ranger Chen announced, his voice carrying across the camp. All teams gear up and prepare to move out in 15 minutes. As the camp burst into frenzied activity, Frank felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Ranger Holden looking at him with concern. Frank, I know we agreed you'd stay at base camp, but given these new developments, maybe it would be best if you headed back home. Part of Frank wanted to agree, to flee back to the safety of his cabin and Sarah's arms, but a stronger part, the part that had survived countless hunts and wilderness expeditions, refused to back down. I'm staying, he said firmly. I won't go into the field, but I can still help coordinate from here. I know these woods, Ranger. I can be your eyes and ears. Ranger Holden hesitated, then nodded. All right, but you stay in constant radio contact. Understand any sign of trouble, and we pull you out immediately. As the teams headed out, the base camp fell into an eerie quiet. Frank found himself alone in the command tent, surrounded by maps and radio equipment. The waiting was excruciating. Every crackle of the radio made him jump, his imagination conjuring horrific scenarios. Hours crawled by. Reports trickled in from the field teams, each one ratcheting up the tension. Signs of the bear were everywhere. Tracks, broken branches, fresh droppings, but the animal itself remained frustratingly elusive. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Frank's radio crackled to life. Base camp, this is Team Charlie. We found something, over. Frank leaned forward, his heart pounding. This is base camp. Go ahead, Team Charlie. We're at the caves, Frank mentioned. There's a lot of blood here, and remains. Animal and human. Over. Frank closed his eyes, a wave of nausea washing over him. When he opened them again, his gaze fell on his cane, propped against the table. In that moment, something shifted inside him. The fear that had been his constant companion since the attack didn't disappear, but it transformed, hardening into resolve. With a grunt of effort, Frank pushed himself to his feet. He keyed the radio. Team Charlie, this is Frank. I'm coming to you. Over. There was a pause, then, negative, Frank. You're to remain at base camp. Over. Not a request, Charlie, Frank replied, already moving towards the tent entrance. I know where you are. I can guide the other teams to your location faster than any map. We're losing daylight, and that bear is too damn close to hurting anyone else. I'm coming. Out. Ignoring the protest squawking from the radio, Frank emerged from the tent. The camp was nearly deserted, with only a skeleton crew remaining. He made his way to one of the parked ATVs, thanking his lucky stars that Sarah had insisted he keep the keys to their own vehicle on his keyring. As he swung his leg over the ATV, a voice called out, Mr. Jacobs, what do you think you're doing? Frank. turned to see a young ranger hurrying towards him, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. "What needs to be done?" Frank replied, firing up the engine. "Tell Ranger Holden I'm sorry, but I can't sit this one out." Before the ranger could protest further, Frank gunned the engine and took off down the forest trail. The wind whipped at his face, carrying with it the rich scents of pine and loam. Despite the gravity of the situation, Frank felt a surge of exhilaration. This was his element, the wilderness he knew like the back of his hand. As he navigated the winding trails, Frank's mind raced. He knew he was breaking his promise, knew he was potentially putting himself and others at risk, but he also knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that this was where he needed to be. The light was fading fast. As Frank approached the area where Team Charlie had reported in, he killed the engine, letting the ATV coast to a stop. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the usual evening chorus of birds and insects conspicuously absent. Frank eased himself off the ATV, wincing at the pain in his back. He retrieved his rifle from its holster on the vehicle, the familiar weight, both comforting and terrifying. This wasn't a hunting trip, this was something else entirely. As he moved deeper into the woods, Frank's senses were on high alert. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. But underlying the fear was something else, a sense of rightness, of coming full circle. A low whistle caught his attention. Frank turned to see Ranger Chen emerging from behind a tree, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. "What the hell are you doing here, Frank?" the ranger hissed. "You're supposed to be at base camp." Frank met the ranger's gaze steadily. "I'm where I need to be, Ranger. Now where's this cave you found?" For a moment it looked like Ranger Chen might argue, but something in Frank's demeanor must have convinced him. With a resigned sigh, he gestured for Frank to follow. As they approached the cave entrance, the coppery scent of blood hit Frank like a wave. He steeled himself, pushing down the memories of his own attack that threatened to overwhelm him. "It's in there," Ranger Chen whispered, indicating the dark maw of the cave. "We've got teams covering all the other exits we could find," but Frank nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. The bear was cornered, and a cornered predator was the most dangerous kind. "I'm going in," Frank said, his voice low but firm. Ranger Chen grabbed his arm. "Frank, no. You're not equipped. You're injured." "I'm the one it let live," Frank interrupted. Maybe there's a reason for that. I have to try." Before the ranger could protest further, Frank shouldered his rifle and stepped into the cave's yawning entrance. The darkness swallowed him, the cool, damp air a sharp contrast to the warm evening outside. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, Frank moved deeper into the cave, every sense straining for any sign of the bear. The beam of his flashlight danced over rock formations, creating shifting shadows that played tricks on his eyes. A low growl froze him in his tracks. Slowly, Frank swung his light towards the sound. There, in a far corner of the cave, two eyes gleamed in the darkness. Eyes that Frank had seen before in a moment of terror and clarity in the forest. "Hello again," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "I think it's time we finish this, you and I." The bear rose to its full height, a mountain of fur and muscle. But as it stepped into the beam of Frank's flashlight, he saw something he hadn't noticed before, a deep, festering wound on the bear's flank. In that moment, understanding washed over Frank. This wasn't a monster, wasn't an evil to be vanquished. This was a wounded animal, lashing out in pain and confusion. Frank lowered his rifle, his fingers trembling on the trigger guard. "Easy now," he murmured, taking a slow step backward. "Nobody else needs to get hurt here." The bear huffed, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very rock beneath Frank's feet. It took a lumbering step forward, then another. Time seemed to stretch, each second lasting an eternity. Frank's finger tightened on the trigger, every instinct screaming at him to fire. But something held him back. A connection, an understanding, born of shared pain and survival. "Come on," Frank whispered, taking another step back. "That's it. Follow me out. There's a whole forest out there, big guy. No need for either of us to die in this cave." Inch by agonizing inch, Frank retreated towards the cave entrance, the bear following with slow, deliberate steps. The light at the mouth of the cave grew brighter, and Frank could hear the shouts of the rangers outside. As they emerged into the fading daylight, a dozen rifles snapped up, all trained on the massive bear. Frank held up a hand, his voice ringing. "Out with unexpected strength. Hold your fire. Nobody shoots unless I say so." The bear paused at the cave entrance, blinking in the light. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, man and beast locked eyes. In that gaze, Frank saw not the mindless killing machine he had feared, but a fellow creature of the wilderness, powerful, dangerous, but ultimately just trying to survive. With a final huff that might have been a farewell or a warning, the bear turned and lumbered off into the forest. The rangers kept their rifles trained on its retreating form, but no shots rang out. As the bear disappeared into the gathering dusk, Frank felt his legs give way. Strong hands caught him, lowering him gently to the ground. Ranger Chen's face swam into view, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. "Frank, are you all right?" Frank nodded, a tired smile spreading across his face. Yeah, I think I am." As the rangers bustled around him, calling for medical support and securing the area, Frank gazed into the darkening forest. The fear that had gripped him since the attack was still there, a reminder of the power and unpredictability of nature. But alongside it was something new, a profound respect and a sense of peace. He had faced his fear, had looked into the eyes of the beast that had nearly killed him, and had found not an enemy, but a reflection of the wild, untamable spirit of the wilderness he loved. As the first stars began to twinkle in the twilight sky, Frank Jacobs knew that while his days of hunting might be over, his connection to these woods and all the creatures that called them home was stronger than ever. Frank leaned heavily on his cane as he made his way down the narrow trail, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. The forest around him was alive with the sounds of early summer, birdsong, rustling leaves, and the distant gurgle of a stream. 6 months had passed since his encounter with the bear, and this was his first time back in the deep woods since that fateful day. Sarah walked beside him, her steps slow and measured to match his halting pace. Her eyes darted constantly between Frank and their surroundings, a mixture of concern and alertness etched on her face. "We can turn back any time," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "There's no shame in it." Frank shook his head, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple despite the cool air. "No," he said, his voice gruff with determination. "I need to do this. Need to prove to myself that I can." They continued on in silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath their boots and the rhythmic tap of Frank's cane. As they rounded a bend in the trail, a clearing opened up before them. Frank froze, his grip tightening on the cane until his knuckles turned white. "This is it," he whispered, his eyes scanning the peaceful glade. "This is where it happened." Sarah squeezed his arm reassuringly. "You're okay, Frank. We're safe here." Frank nodded absently, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The clearing looked so different in the warm sunlight of early summer. Wildflowers dotted the grass, their cheerful colors a stark contrast to the terror he'd experienced here. Yet beneath the beauty, he could still see the scars of that day. A fallen log where he'd stumbled, the remnants of broken branches from his frantic flight. With a deep breath, Frank took a tentative step into the clearing. Then another. Sarah remained close, a steadying presence at his side. As they reached the center of the glade, Frank lowered himself carefully onto a sun-warmed rock, wincing slightly as his still healing back protested the movement. "You know," he said after a long moment of silence, "I've been coming to these woods for over 40 years. Thought I knew every tree, every trail, every creature that called this place home." He let out a humorless chuckle. "Turns out I didn't." "Oh, a damn thing." Sarah sat beside him, her hand finding his. "You're one of the most experienced outdoorsmen I know, Frank. What happened that day, it could have happened to anyone." Frank shook his head, his eyes distant. "No, it couldn't have. I got cocky, Sarah. Forgot the most important rule of the wilderness. We're guests here, not masters. And nature has a way of reminding us of that fact." A rustle in the undergrowth across the clearing made them both stiffen. Frank's heart rate spiked, his body tensing for flight. But it was only a doe stepping daintily into the open. She regarded them with liquid brown eyes for a moment before bending her graceful neck to graze. Frank let out a shaky breath, forcing his taut muscles to relax. Christ, he muttered. Some mighty hunter I am now, jumping at every shadow. Sarah leaned into him, her voice soft but firm. You're healing, Frank. It takes time. Remember what Dr. Lawson said in your therapy sessions. It's okay to be afraid. It's how we deal with that fear that matters. Frank nodded, watching the doe as she moved serenely through the clearing. I know, it's just, I've spent my whole life in these woods. They were my second home, my escape. And now, he trailed off, unable to put into words the conflicting emotions roiling inside him. And now they can be again, Sarah finished for him. Maybe not in the same way as before, but in a new way. You've always talked about wanting to share your love of nature with others. Maybe this is your chance. Frank turned to look at her, a spark of interest in his eyes. What do you mean? Sarah smiled, warming to her idea. Well, you've got all this knowledge, all these years of experience. Why not put it to use? You could lead nature walks, teach wilderness safety courses, help people understand and respect these woods the way you do. Frank was quiet for a long moment, considering. The idea had merit. He might not be able to hunt like he used to, might never feel entirely safe in the deep woods again. But to share his knowledge, to help others see the beauty and power of nature, that was something he could do. You know, he said slowly, that's not a bad idea, not bad at all. Their conversation was interrupted by the crackle of a radio. Ranger Mike Holden stepped into the clearing, his expression a mixture of relief and exasperation. There you two are, he said, approaching them. When I saw your truck at the trailhead, I figured you might be out here. Frank nodded in greeting. Mike, good to see you. The ranger's eyes swept the clearing, no doubt remembering the chaos of that day 6 months ago. How are you holding up, Frank? Being back here and all? Frank considered the question. Honestly, it's harder than I thought it would be, but necessary, I think. Mike nodded in understanding. Well, I'm glad you're here. There's actually something I wanted to talk to you about. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. The department's been discussing implementing some new wilderness safety programs, especially in light of recent events. We were hoping you might be interested in consulting with us. Frank and Sarah exchanged a surprised look. Consulting? Frank asked. Mike nodded eagerly. Your experience would be invaluable, Frank. Not just your knowledge of the woods, but your first-hand experience with wildlife encounters. We think your perspective could really help shape our approach to public education and safety measures. Frank felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. I'd be honored, Mike. Truly. The ranger smiled, relief evident on his face. That's great to hear, Frank, really great. We'll set up a meeting next week to discuss the details, if that works for you. Frank nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I'll be there. As Mike radioed back to base, Frank turned. To Sarah, his eyes shining with a mixture of emotion. You hear that? Seems like your idea's catching on already. Sarah squeezed his hand, her smile radiant. I'm so proud of you, Frank. This is a new chapter, a chance to make a real difference. Frank nodded, his gaze sweeping across the clearing once more. The shadows that had seemed so threatening earlier now felt different, still powerful, still worthy of respect, but no longer overwhelming. He realized that while the forest had changed for him, so too had he changed. The experience had left its scars, both physical and emotional, but it had also opened his eyes to a new way of seeing the wilderness he loved. You know, he said softly, I think I'm ready to head back now. Sarah stood, offering her hand to help him up. Let's go home then. As they made their way back down the trail, Frank found his steps a little lighter, his grip on the cane a little less desperate. The forest around them was still wild, still unpredictable, but it was also familiar, welcoming in its own way. At the trailhead, Frank paused, looking back at the sea of green stretching out before him. The fear was still there, a low hum in the back of his mind. But alongside it was something else, a renewed sense of wonder, a deep respect for the untamed beauty of nature, and a burning desire to share that with others. You ready? Sarah asked, her hand on the truck's door handle. Frank took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp, pine-scented air. Yeah, he said, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "Yeah, I think I am." As they drove away, the forest receding in the rearview mirror, Frank felt a sense of peace settling over him. He might never be the same man he was before the attack, but perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing. The wilderness had taught him its harshest lesson, but in doing so, it had also shown him a new path forward. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But with Sarah by his side and a newfound purpose in his heart, Frank Jacobs was ready to face whatever lay ahead, one step at a time. Frank stood at the edge of the forest clearing, his hands steady, on the shoulders of a wide-eyed group of teenagers. The summer sun filtered through the canopy, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. It had been nearly a year since his encounter with the bear, and while the physical scars had faded, the memory remained etched in his mind. "All right, folks," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "This is where we start to put everything you've learned into practice. Remember, we're guests in these woods. Respect them, and they'll respect you back." A lanky boy with a mop of unruly hair raised his hand. "Mr. Jacobs, what if we see a bear?" Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest, but pushed through it. "Good question, Tommy. First things first, don't panic. Remember what we talked about. Make yourself look big, speak in a firm voice, and slowly back away. Most times the bear wants to avoid you as much as you want to avoid it." As the group nodded, absorbing his words, Frank couldn't help but marvel at the turn his life had taken. What had started as Sarah's suggestion and Ranger Holden's offer had blossomed into a full-fledged wilderness education program. 3 times a week, Frank led groups of all ages through the Chugach National Forest, teaching them about wildlife, survival skills, and the delicate balance of nature. "All right, let's move out," Frank said, tapping his walking stick on the ground. "Stay together, keep your eyes and ears open, and remember, leave no trace." As they began their hike, Frank found himself hyper-aware of their surroundings. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent a jolt through his system. But with each outing, each successful trip, the fear loosened its grip a little more. Halfway through their hike, a girl named Emily spotted fresh bear tracks in the soft earth near a stream. The group huddled around, excitement and nervousness palpable in the air. Frank knelt down, wincing slightly as his back protested. "Good eye, Emily. Now, what can these tracks tell us?" The teenagers shared uncertain glances before a freckled girl named Sarah spoke up. "They're too big," Frank chuckled. "That they are. Anything else?" Tommy squinted at the tracks. "They're heading away from us, right? Towards the stream." "Excellent observation," Frank nodded. The bear was likely heading to the water for a drink, or to fish. And judging by the depth and clarity of the prints, I'd say these are fairly recent. Within the last few hours, at least. A ripple of excitement mixed with apprehension ran through the group. Frank stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Now this is a perfect example of why we need to be aware of our surroundings. We're in bear country, and we need to respect that. Let's move on, but keep your voices low and stay alert." As they continued their hike, Frank found himself lost in thought. A year ago, the sight of those tracks would have sent him into a panic. Now, while his heart rate had certainly picked up, he felt a strange sense of acceptance. The bear was out there, living its life, just as they were living theirs. The rest of the hike passed without incident, and as they emerged from the trail, back at the ranger station, Frank felt the familiar mix of relief and accomplishment. The teenagers were chattering excitedly, their earlier nervousness replaced by enthusiasm. Ranger Chen was waiting for them, a smile on his face. "How'd it go, Frank?" "Not bad," Frank replied, running a hand through his graying hair. "Found some fresh bear tracks. Good learning experience for the kids," Chen's eyebrows rose. "Bear tracks where?" Frank described the location, watching as the ranger made notes. "I'll send a team to check it out just in case. You did good, Frank. These kids are lucky to have you as a teacher." As the teenagers dispersed to waiting parents, Frank felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Sarah standing there, her eyes twinkling. "Another successful expedition, I see," she said, planting a kiss on his cheek. Frank nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Seems that way. You know, a year ago I never would have thought I'd be doing this. Leading hikes, teaching kids about the woods. Hell, I wasn't sure I'd ever set foot in the forest again." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You've come a long way, Frank. I'm so proud of you." As they walked to their truck, Frank's mind wandered back to the bear tracks they'd found. He couldn't help but wonder if it was the same bear, his bear. The thought no longer filled him with terror, but with a strange mix of respect and curiosity. "Penny for your thoughts?" Sarah asked as they drove home. Frank was quiet for a moment. "I was just thinking about the bear. You know, I've never told anyone this, but that day in the cave, when I looked into its eyes, I saw something. Not just a mindless beast, but a creature with its own life, its own struggles." Sarah listened intently, knowing how rare it was for Frank to open up. "About that day, I think that's why I couldn't shoot," Frank continued. "In that moment I realized we were both just trying to survive, and now teaching these kids, helping them understand the wilderness. It feels like I'm honoring that moment, you know?" Sarah reached over, squeezing his hand. "I think I do. And I think you're doing something incredible, Frank. You're turning a traumatic experience into something positive, something that could save lives." As they pulled up to their cabin, Frank saw a familiar figure waiting on the porch. Ranger Holden stood up as they approached, his face serious. "Mike," Frank greeted, a note of concern in his voice. "What brings you out here?" The ranger took a deep breath. "Frank, Sarah, I've got some news. You might want to sit down for this." They settled onto the porch chairs, tension thick in the air. Ranger Holden leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "We've been tracking bear movements in the area, as you know, and, well, we think we've identified the bear that attacked you, Frank." Frank felt his heart skip a beat. "What? How?" "Trail cameras, mostly, and the pattern of its movements matches what we know from your encounter. It's been staying mostly to the deep woods, avoiding human contact, but..." "But what?" Sarah asked, her hand finding Frank's. Ranger Holden sighed. "But its territory is expanding. We're worried it might be pushing closer to populated areas. The department, they're considering authorizing a hunt." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, ignoring the twinge in his back, and walked to the edge of the porch. The forest stretched out before him, dark and imposing in the fading light. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, we can't do that." Sarah and Ranger Holden exchanged glances. "Frank," the ranger said gently, "I know this is difficult, but we have to consider public safety. If this bear continues to pose a threat..." "It's not posing a threat," Frank interrupted, turning back to face them. "You said yourself it's been avoiding human contact. It's just trying to live." The ranger stood, his face sympathetic but firm. "I understand how you feel, Frank, but we can't take the risk. If it wanders into a campground or a hiking trail..." Frank closed his eyes, memories of that day in the cave flooding back. The fear, the pain, but also the connection, the understanding that had passed between man and beast in that moment. "Give me a chance," he said suddenly, opening his eyes. "Let me try to find it. To relocate it, if necessary." Sarah stood, alarm clear on her face. "Frank, no, you can't be serious." But Frank's mind was made up. He turned to Ranger Holden, his eyes blazing with determination. "You've seen what I can do, Mike. I know these woods better than anyone. Let me try to find a solution that doesn't end with a dead bear and a forest full of trigger-happy hunters." The ranger was quiet for a long moment, considering. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, Frank. I can give you a week. But if we can't find a solution by then, or if there's any sign of the bear becoming more aggressive..." "I understand," Frank said, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Mike. I won't let you down." As the ranger left, Sarah turned to Frank, her eyes wide with a mix of admiration and fear. "Frank Jacobs, you're either the bravest man I've ever known, or the craziest." Frank managed a small smile. "Probably a bit of both, love." He gazed out at the darkening forest, a sense of purpose settling over him. "But I've got to try. For the bear, for the forest, and for me." As night fell, Frank stood on the porch long after Sarah had gone inside. The forest whispered to him, full of secrets and dangers, but also beauty and life. He knew the challenge ahead would test him in ways he couldn't imagine. But for the first time since that fateful day, Frank felt truly alive, ready to face whatever the wilderness might throw at him. Tomorrow, he would begin his search. Tomorrow, he would step back into the deep woods, not as a victim or a teacher, but as a man seeking balance between two worlds. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to protect both the people he loved and the wild creature that had changed his life forever. Frank zipped up his jacket, the early morning chill biting at his exposed skin. The forest loomed before him, a wall of green and shadow. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said softly, her hand on his arm. "No one would blame you for walking away." Frank turned to his wife, seeing the worry etched in the lines of her face. He managed a small smile. "I know, love, but I do have to do this. For myself, for the bear, for everyone." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes even as fear clouded them. "Just be careful. Promise me you'll come back." "Always," Frank replied, pulling her into a tight embrace. As he held her, he breathed in her familiar scent, drawing strength from her presence. Ranger Holden approached, a backpack slung over his shoulder. "You ready, Frank?" Frank nodded, releasing Sarah. "As I'll ever be." The ranger handed him the backpack. "Emergency supplies, radio, and a tranquilizer gun. Remember, this is a last resort. We want to track and observe, not engage, unless absolutely necessary." "Understood," Frank said, shouldering the pack. Its weight was comforting, grounding him in the reality of the task ahead. As they prepared to set out, a truck pulled up. Ranger Chen stepped out, followed by a woman Frank didn't recognize. "Frank." "Mike," Chen called out in greeting. "I hope you don't mind, but I thought we could use an expert on this expedition." He gestured to the woman. "This is Dr. Elena Reeves, wildlife biologist specializing in bear behavior." Dr. Reeves stepped forward, extending her hand. "Mr. Jacobs, it's an honor to meet you. I've heard a lot about your encounter and your work since then." Frank shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the keen intelligence in her eyes. "Glad to have you with us, Dr. Reeves. We can use all the help we can get." With final goodbyes to Sarah, the team of 4 set out into the forest. Frank took the lead, his steps sure despite the lingering stiffness in his back. The familiar sounds and smells of the woods enveloped him, simultaneously comforting and unnerving. As they hiked, Dr. Reeves fell into step beside Frank. "Mr. Jacobs, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what do you hope to accomplish out here?" Frank was quiet for a moment, considering. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. I just know we need to find a solution that doesn't end with a dead bear or endangered hikers." "And if we can't find that solution," she pressed gently. Frank's jaw tightened. "Then at least we'll know we tried everything possible before resorting to lethal measures." They hiked for hours, Frank leading them deeper into the wilderness. He pointed out signs of bear activity, scratch marks on trees, overturned rocks, scat. Dr. Reeves examined each piece of evidence carefully, making notes in a small notebook. As the sun climbed higher, they paused in a small clearing to rest and rehydrate. Frank sank onto a fallen log, massaging his aching back. "You okay there, old-timer?" Ranger Holden asked, a note of concern in his voice. Frank waved him off. "I'm fine, just not as young as I used to be." Dr. Reeves approached, her notebook in hand. "Mr. Jacobs, based on the evidence we've seen, I believe we're on the right track. The bear seems to be establishing a clear territory, which is both good and bad news." "How so?" Frank asked, taking a swig from his water bottle. "Well, it means the bear is behaving normally, not exhibiting any unusual aggression, but it also means it's likely to stay in this area, which brings it into potential conflict with humans." Frank nodded, processing this information. "So what do you suggest?" Dr. Reeves sat beside him on the log. "Ideally, we'd find a way to encourage the bear to move to a less populated area, but that's easier said than done. Bears are creatures of habit, and this one has clearly decided this is its home." As they discussed potential strategies, a sharp crack echoed through the forest. Everyone froze, eyes scanning the surrounding trees. "What was that?" Ranger Chen whispered, his hand moving to his holster. Frank held up a hand for silence, his ears straining. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of breaking branches coming from the dense undergrowth to their left. "Nobody move," Frank breathed, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, deliberately, a massive form emerged from the shadows. Frank felt his breath catch in his throat. There, not 30 yards away, stood the bear. His bear, Time seemed to stand still as man and beast regarded each other. Frank could hear the rapid breathing of his companions, could sense their tension, but his focus was entirely on the bear. It was larger than he remembered, its brown fur gleaming in the dappled sunlight. A jagged scar ran along its flank, a remnant of their previous encounter, but it was the eyes that captured Frank's attention. Intelligent, wary, and somehow familiar. "Easy now," Frank murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody make any sudden moves." Dr. Reeves's voice was tight with controlled fear. "Mr. Jacobs, we need to back away slowly. This situation is extremely dangerous." But Frank couldn't move. He was transfixed, caught in the bear's gaze. In that moment, he was transported back to the cave, to that pivotal moment when predator and prey had reached an unspoken understanding. The bear huffed, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through the clearing. It took a lumbering step forward, so then another. "Frank," Ranger Holden hissed urgently, "we need to go, now." But Frank stood his ground. Slowly, telegraphing his movements, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of berries he'd gathered earlier. With a gentle underhand toss, he scattered them on the ground between them. The bear paused, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent. For a heart-stopping moment, Frank thought it might charge. But then, to everyone's amazement, it lowered its massive head and began to eat the berries. "Incredible," Dr. Reeves breathed. It's not displaying any aggression. This is highly unusual behavior." Frank nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "He remembers," he said softly. "He remembers me." As the bear finished the berries, it looked up at Frank once more. There was no anger in its gaze, no hunger, just a calm acceptance of their shared presence. Slowly, carefully, Frank began to back away. "Come on," he murmured to the others. "Let's give him some space." They retreated to a safe distance, watching as the bear lumbered off into the forest. Once it was out of sight, the tension in the group released like a snapped rubber band. "What the hell was that?" Ranger Chen demanded, his voice shaky. Dr. Reeves was scribbling frantically in her notebook. "That was unprecedented. The bear's behavior, its apparent recognition of Mr. Jacobs. This could change everything we thought we knew about bear-human interactions." Frank leaned against a tree, suddenly exhausted. The encounter had drained him physically and emotionally, but underneath the fatigue was a growing sense of hope. "So what now?" Ranger Holden asked, holstering his tranquilizer gun. Frank straightened up, his mind racing with possibilities. "Now we come up with a plan, one that keeps both the bear and people safe." Over the next several hours, they hiked back towards the ranger station, deep in discussion. Dr. Reeves proposed a study, using trail cameras and non-invasive tracking methods to better understand the bear's behavior and movement patterns. Frank suggested expanding the wilderness education program, teaching more people how to safely coexist with wildlife. As they emerged from the forest, Sarah was waiting, pacing anxiously by the ranger station. When she saw Frank, she ran to him, enveloping him in a tight embrace. "Thank God," she breathed. "When I heard there had been a bear sighting, I feared the worst." Frank held her close, feeling the last of the day's tension drain away. "It's okay, love. Everything's okay." Over Sarah's shoulder, he saw Ranger Holden speaking with his superiors, gesturing animatedly. Dr. Reeves was already on the phone, presumably calling colleagues about her unprecedented observations. Frank knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be bureaucratic hurdles, skeptics to convince, and always the unpredictable nature of wild animals to contend with. But for the first time since his attack, he felt truly hopeful. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Frank stood at the edge of the forest. The trees whispered in the evening breeze, a sound that once filled him with dread, but now brought a sense of peace. Sarah came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Frank squeezed her hand, his gaze fixed on the darkening woods. "I'm thinking that maybe, just maybe, We've found a way to bridge two worlds, to find a balance between the wild and the civilized. He turned to her, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. And I'm thinking that this old hunter might have found a new purpose. As they walked back to their cabin, hand in hand, Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The forest that had nearly claimed his life had also given him a second chance, a new perspective, and he was determined to make the most of it for himself, for the community, and for the magnificent creature that roamed the wilderness beyond. The journey ahead would be challenging, filled with uncertainties and potential dangers. But Frank Jacobs was ready to face it, one step at a time, with a newfound respect for the delicate balance between man and nature. In the end, he realized, they were all just trying to survive, to carve out a place in this wild, beautiful world. And maybe, just maybe, there was room for all of them. Frank stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on its edges as he surveyed the packed auditorium. The faces looking back at him were a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and hope. He took a deep breath, feeling the familiar twinge in his back, a constant reminder of his encounter 2 years ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, despite the butterflies in his stomach, "thank you for coming today. What I'm about to propose might sound crazy to some of you. Hell, 2 years ago I would have thought it was crazy myself." A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd, easing some of the tension in the room. "As many of you know, I had let's call it a close encounter with a brown bear right here in Chugach National Forest. An encounter that nearly cost me my life." Frank paused, his mind momentarily transported back to that terrifying day. He shook it off, focusing on the present. "But what you might not know is that same bear taught me one of the most important lessons of my life." He clicked a button on the remote in his hand, and an image appeared on the screen behind him. A trail camera photo of a massive brown bear, a jagged scar visible on its flank. "This is him," Frank said, turning to look at the image. "The bear that attacked me, the bear that by all rights should have killed me, but he didn't. And in the 2 years since our encounter, he's shown us something remarkable, the possibility of coexistence." Frank clicked through a series of images, the bear foraging peacefully, avoiding hiking trails, even seeming to pause and watch a group of hikers from a safe distance. "What you're seeing is the result of 2 years of intensive study and a revolutionary approach to wildlife management. Working with Dr. Elena Reeves and the dedicated rangers of Chugach National Forest, we've implemented a program that focuses on understanding and adapting to bear behavior, rather than trying to control or eliminate it." He paused, looking out at the audience. In the front row he saw Sarah, her eyes shining with pride. Next to her sat Ranger Holden and Dr. Reeves, both nodding encouragingly. "The Bear-Aware program we're proposing isn't just about protecting humans from bears. It's about protecting bears from humans, too. It's about finding a way for all of us to share this beautiful wilderness responsibly and safely." Frank clicked to the next slide, showing a map of the forest with various colored zones. "Our program involves several key components. First, we've established clear bear zones, areas where we know our ursine friends are likely to be active. These aren't off-limits to humans, but they do require extra precautions and awareness." He went on to explain the other aspects of the program: enhanced education for hikers and campers, a network of bear-proof food storage lockers at campsites, and a state-of-the-art warning system using trail cameras and AI to predict bear movements. "But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of our program," Frank continued, his voice growing passionate, "is our Bear Ambassador initiative." He clicked to a new slide, showing himself and Dr. Reeves standing a safe distance from the scarred bear. "We've found that this particular bear, and potentially others, can become accustomed to human presence in a non-threatening way. By carefully and safely habituating them to humans who respect their space and don't provide food rewards, we can reduce the likelihood of surprise encounters and aggressive behavior." A hand shot up in the audience. Frank nodded to the man, a local journalist he recognized. "Mr. Jacobs, isn't this incredibly dangerous? You're essentially encouraging people to get close to wild, potentially deadly animals." Frank smiled, having anticipated this question. "A fair point, John, and you're right. Bears are wild animals and should always be treated with caution and respect. We're not encouraging people to approach bears or treat them like pets. What we're doing is creating a framework for safe, controlled interactions that benefit both species. He clicked to another slide, this one showing statistics. In the 2 years since we began this program as a pilot, we've seen a 70% reduction in bear-related incidents in Chugach. Not a single human has been injured by a bear in the test areas, and we haven't had to relocate or euthanize a single bear. The room buzzed with murmurs of surprise and approval. Frank felt a surge of hope. They were listening, really listening. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, he continued. You're thinking this is just one bear, one lucky case, and you're not entirely wrong. Our scarred friend here is unique. He's shown an unusual tolerance for human presence, but the principles we've developed through studying him can be applied more broadly. He clicked through more slides, showing similar programs being piloted in other national parks and wilderness areas. From Yellowstone to Denali, wildlife managers are starting to adopt elements of our approach. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but it's a start towards a future where we don't have to choose between human safety and wildlife conservation. As Frank wrapped up his presentation, he could feel the energy in the room. There were still skeptical faces, still concerns to be addressed, but there was also excitement, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there when he started. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you not just as a survivor of a bear attack, but as someone who's had his eyes opened to the true nature of these magnificent creatures. They're not monsters to be feared, or obstacles to be removed. They're an integral part of the wilderness we all love. Frank's voice softened, filled with emotion. 2 years ago, I thought my relationship with these woods was over. I was afraid, angry, and lost. But that bear, the very creature I feared most, showed me a new way forward. He taught me that respect, understanding, and coexistence are possible, even in the face of our deepest fears. He looked out at the audience, making eye contact with as many people as he could. I'm asking you today to take a leap of faith, to believe that we can find a better way to live alongside wildlife, to support the Bear Aware program and help us create a model for wildlife management that can be used around the world. As Frank finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. He stepped back from the podium, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. As people began to stand, asking questions and discussing amongst themselves, Sarah made her way to the stage. "You did it, Frank," she said, pulling him into a hug. "You really did it." Over her shoulder, Frank saw Ranger Holden approaching, a broad smile on his face. "That was something else, Frank. I think you've won over even the skeptics." Dr. Reeves joined them, her eyes bright with excitement. "The questions I'm hearing, people are engaged, really thinking about this. We've opened the door to a whole new approach." As the group fielded questions and discussed next steps, Frank found his gaze drawn to the image still displayed on the screen, the scarred bear, his bear, looking almost directly into the camera. In that moment, he felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the bear, but to the entire ecosystem they were working to protect. Later that evening, as Frank and Sarah walked along the edge of the forest near their cabin, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant hues, Frank felt a peace he hadn't known in years. "You know," he said, pausing to look out at the trees, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for what happened that day." Sarah looked at him quizzically. "Grateful for almost being killed by a bear?" Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "Not for that exactly, but for the perspective it gave me, for showing me that there's always more to learn, always a new way to look at things." He turned to his wife, taking her hands in his. "I was so lost after the attack. I thought my life in these woods was over. But now I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm meant to do." Sarah smiled, squeezing his hands. "You've always belonged here, Frank. You just needed to find a new way to fit." As they stood there, the forest coming alive with the sounds of evening, Frank heard a distant rumble, the unmistakable sound of a bear's call. Instead of fear, he felt a thrill of excitement, of connection. "Come on," he said, tugging Sarah's hand gently. "Let's head in, we've got a big day tomorrow." As they walked back to the cabin, Frank's mind was already racing with plans for the future. Expanded education programs, new research projects, ways to bring more people into this new understanding of wildlife. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, critics to convince, and always the unpredictable nature of wild animals to contend with. But for the first time in a long time, Frank Jacobs felt truly alive, truly purposeful. He had found a way to turn his darkest moment into a force for positive change. And as he looked out at the deepening twilight, he sent a silent thanks to the scarred bear that had set him on this new path. The wilderness that had nearly claimed his life had given him a new one instead. And Frank was determined to make the most of it, for himself, for his community, and for the magnificent creatures that called these woods home. The tranquil beauty of Chugach National Forest had long been a draw for nature enthusiasts, hikers, and adventure seekers. But in the summer of 2025, a series of unsettling encounters with an unusually aggressive brown bear began to cast a shadow over the pristine wilderness. The events that unfolded over the course of several months would challenge the delicate balance between human recreation and wildlife preservation, ultimately leading to a dramatic showdown that would change the forest forever. The first incident occurred on a warm June morning, when experienced hiker Maria Gonzalez stumbled upon fresh bear tracks near Eklutna Lake. The size and depth of the prints immediately set off alarm bells in her mind. With over a decade of backcountry experience, Maria knew these weren't the marks of an ordinary bear. "I've seen plenty of bear signs before," Maria would later recount to park officials, her voice still tinged with awe and a hint of fear. But these were something else. It was like tracking a prehistoric monster. Maria's discovery marked the beginning of what would become known as the Summer of the Shadow, a period of heightened tension and fear in the Chugach community. Park rangers increased patrols and posted additional warning signs, but the bear remained elusive, a phantom in the pines that seemed to vanish into thin air whenever search parties drew near. As word spread of the massive bear, some dismissed the stories as exaggeration or folklore. But those who had seen the tracks or caught fleeting glimpses of the creature knew better. The bear was real, and it was growing bolder. The second notable encounter came in early July when Park Ranger Tom Chen had a face-to-face confrontation with the bear on a routine patrol. The incident left Tom shaken and provided the first clear confirmation of the bear's unusual size and aggressive behavior. "I've worked these woods for 15 years, Tom reported, his usual calm demeanor noticeably rattled. "Never seen anything like it. This bear, it didn't run. It stood its ground and looked at me like I was the intruder. For a moment there, I wasn't sure which one of us was the apex predator." Tom's encounter led to the closure of several popular hiking trails and campgrounds. The tension in the air was palpable as local businesses that relied on summer tourism began to feel the pinch. Debates raged in town hall meetings and online forums about how to address the situation. Some called for an immediate hunt to eliminate the threat, while others advocated for less drastic measures. As July turned to August, the bear seemed to grow more territorial. Sightings increased, each one adding to the growing legend of the Chugach Colossus, as some had taken to calling it. But it was the third major encounter that truly brought home the danger lurking in the woods. On a crisp August night, the Johnstone family's camping trip turned into a nightmare when the bear invaded their campsite. Sarah Johnstone, mother of 2 young children, found herself face to face with the massive creature as it rummaged through their food supplies. "I've never felt so small, so utterly helpless," Sarah recounted, her voice breaking as she described the ordeal. "All I could think was, please just take the food and leave us alone. I was certain we were going to die right there. Thanks." To quick thinking and a well-practiced bear safety drill, the Johnstone family managed to retreat to their vehicle unharmed. But the incident was a stark reminder of the fine line between wilderness adventure and potential tragedy. The Johnstone encounter sparked a firestorm of controversy. Local officials faced mounting pressure to take decisive action. Emergency meetings were called, experts consulted, and a plan was finally put into motion. So a team of wildlife biologists and experienced trackers was assembled with the goal of locating and potentially relocating the bear. But the Chugach Colossus had other plans. As summer waned and the first hints of autumn touched the forest, tension reached a fever pitch. Tourists had all but abandoned the area, and even long-time residents were thinking twice before venturing into the backcountry. It was in this atmosphere of fear and anticipation that the fourth and most dramatic encounter took place. Frank Jacobs, a veteran hunter with decades of experience in the Alaskan wilderness, set out on what he expected to be a routine hunting trip. Armed with his trusty rifle and a lifetime of woodcraft, Frank felt confident in his ability to handle whatever the forest might throw at him. He couldn't have been more wrong. Deep in a remote valley, as the early morning mist still clung to the pines, Frank found himself locked in a battle of wills with the very creature that had been terrorizing the forest all summer. The encounter would push him to the very limits of his skill and courage. "I've stared down grizzlies before," Frank would later tell a captivated audience at the local diner, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of strong coffee. But this was different. This bear wasn't just big, it was smart. It was like it could read my moves before I made them. For nearly an hour, Frank and the bear engaged in a deadly dance through the underbrush. Each time Frank thought he had the upper hand, the bear would counter, driving him back. It was a clash between two apex predators, each fighting for survival in their own way. There was a moment there, Frank recalled, his voice dropping to a near whisper, when I looked into that bear's eyes. And I swear, I saw something there. Not just animal instinct, but intelligence. Like it was sizing me up, same as I was doing to it. The standoff finally ended, when a team of park rangers, alerted by the sound of Frank's warning shots, arrived on the scene. The bear melted back, into the forest, leaving behind a shaken but unharmed Frank and a slew of unanswered questions. In the aftermath of Frank's encounter, the debate over how to handle the Chugach colossus reached a crescendo. Wildlife advocates argued that the bear's behavior, while unusual, didn't warrant lethal action. Hunters and some local residents countered that the risk to human life was too great to ignore. As fall settled over the Chugach National Forest, bringing with it the vibrant colors of changing leaves and the first hints of winter's chill, the community found itself at a crossroads. The decision they would make in the coming days would not only determine the fate of one remarkable bear, but would also set a precedent for how humans and wildlife could coexist in one of the last great wilderness areas. The story of the Chugach Colossus and the Summer of the Shadow had captured imaginations far beyond the borders of Alaska. News crews descended on the small towns bordering the forest, eager to catch a glimpse of the legendary bear or interview those who had encountered it. Environmental groups seized on the story as a rallying cry for wildlife protection, while others saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of encroaching too far into wild spaces. Experts from around the world weighed in, offering theories and potential solutions, but for the people of Chugach, this was more than just a sensational news story or an academic debate. It was about their home, their livelihoods, and their relationship with the wilderness that had shaped their community for generations. As the final decision on how to handle the bear loomed, tensions in the community reached a boiling point. Town hall meetings became heated affairs, with passionate arguments on both sides. Families found themselves divided, friendships strained. In the end, it was Frank Jacobs who would play a pivotal role in shaping the outcome. His encounter with the bear had profoundly changed him, challenging his long-held beliefs about man's place in the natural world. "We've been looking at this. All wrong," Frank declared at a crucial community meeting, his voice ringing out over the murmurs of the crowd. "This bear isn't a problem to be solved. It's a reminder of why we chose to live here in the first place. We're the ones who need to adapt, not the other way around." Frank's words, coming from a man who had once been an advocate for traditional wildlife management practices, struck a chord. In the days that followed, a new plan began to take shape, one that would focus on education, habitat preservation, and finding innovative ways for humans and wildlife to coexist. As winter settled over the Chugach National Forest, blanketing the pines in snow and driving the wildlife into hibernation, a sense of cautious optimism began to replace the fear that had gripped the community for so long. The Chugach colossus, wherever it was, would sleep away the cold months. And when spring returned, it would awaken to a forest change not by force, but by understanding. The Summer of the Shadow had tested the resilience and wisdom of the Chugach community. It had forced them to confront hard truths about their relationship with the wild and to find new ways of defining coexistence. As the long Arctic night settled in, The people of Chugach looked to the future with a mix of apprehension and hope, knowing that their greatest challenge, and perhaps their greatest opportunity, still lay ahead.